The sky burned crimson over Broken Ridge. Lieutenant Mason Reed stood frozen amidst the chaos rifle hanging useless at his side as flames consumed the Apache village. Women screamed, children cried. The acrid scent of gunpowder mingled with burning sage and flesh. "Lieutenant, what are you waiting for?" Captain Victor Blackwood's voice cut through the cacophony, his silhouette stark against the inferno. Blood streaked his uniform, none of it his own. "Finish the job." Mason's throat tightened, watching his fellow soldiers drag terrified villagers from their homes. This wasn't war. This was slaughter. "Sir, these are civilians," he managed voice, barely audible above the crackling flames. Blackwood's face twisted with contempt. "These are savages, Lieutenant. Orders were clear, no survivors." A child's scream pierced the air. Mason turned to see a small girl, no more than 7, running from a burning dwelling. Her mother lay motionless behind her dark blood pooling on packed earth. Before Mason could think, his legs were moving. He sprinted toward the child as one of Blackwood's men raised his rifle. "Stand down!" Mason shouted, throwing himself between them. The soldier hesitated. Blackwood's voice thundered. "I gave an order, Lieutenant." Mason scooped the girl into his arms. Her tiny body trembled against his chest, her eyes wide with terror, but eerily silent. On her wrist, Mason glimpsed a tattoo, 3 triangular shapes arranged like eagle's wings. "This isn't right, Captain. This isn't—" The gunshot came without warning. Searing pain erupted in Mason's shoulder. He staggered, clutching the child tighter as he fell to one knee. Through blurring vision, he saw Blackwood lowering his smoking pistol. "Insubordination during combat operations, Lieutenant Reed." Blackwood stepped closer, raising the pistol again, aiming at Mason's head. "Your choice, court-martial, or death." Mason lunged sideways, still holding the girl. Another shot rang out. Dirt exploded where they had been. "After them!" Blackwood bellowed. Mason ran each step, sending fire through his wounded shoulder. The child didn't make a sound. Not a whimper, not a cry, just the rapid beating of her heart against his chest. They reached the ravine edge, no escape, but down. Without hesitation, Mason jumped. The world spun. Impact knocked the breath from his lungs. He rolled, shielding the girl as they tumbled down the steep slope. Rocks tore at his uniform. Brush scratched his face. Finally, they came to rest at the bottom, hidden in shadow. Above, Blackwood's voice echoed. "Leave him. He won't survive the night. We have a report to file hostile Apache attack. All soldiers responding with appropriate force." "Understood." Murmurs of agreement followed. Mason pressed a hand against his bleeding shoulder, the child still clutched against him. Her dark eyes watched him, terrified, yet somehow trusting. "It's all right," he whispered, though nothing was all right. "I've got you." She said nothing, but her small hand reached up to touch the silver lieutenant's bars on his tattered uniform. The world began to dim around Mason as blood soaked through his jacket. "I'll keep you safe," he promised, as consciousness slipped away. "Whatever it takes." Mason Reed jolted awake, sheets damp with sweat. The familiar nightmare receded, leaving only its ghosts behind. 7 years. 7 years since Broken Ridge, and still the dreams came. Dawn light filtered through worn curtains, illuminating his Spartan cabin. Mason swung his legs over the bed's edge, wincing as his shoulder protested. The old wound always ached after the dream. He reached for the bottle on his nightstand, found it empty, and cursed softly. The mirror above his wash basin reflected a stranger. At 40, Mason barely recognized himself. Beard streaked with premature gray eyes, hollowed by sleepless nights, a jagged scar across his left cheekbone where a rock had cut him during his escape. Nothing remained of Lieutenant Reed except the nightmares and the guilt. He splashed cold water on his face, dressed, and moved through his morning ritual with mechanical precision. Coffee brewing on the cast-iron stove. Rifle checked and loaded for hunting. Journal retrieved from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. Mason sat at his rough-hewn table, opened the leather-bound book, and began to write April 18, 1878. The dream again. 7 years, and I still see their faces. The woman in the doorway. The men against the fences. The child. His pen paused. The child. He never learned her name, never knew if she survived. After tumbling down the ravine, he'd passed out from blood loss. When he woke, she was gone, vanished like smoke. For months, he searched, asking questions in every settlement with an Apache presence. Nothing. Finally, he had retreated here to the Arizona wilderness, where his past couldn't find him. Or so he had thought. Mason closed the journal, tucked it into his shirt, and stepped onto his porch. The morning air carried the scent of sage and dust. His small ranch sprawled before him, modest corral, vegetable garden, smokehouse. It wasn't much, but it was his. A place to hide. A place to forget. He saddled his bay gelding, checked his rifle once more, and rode out. The pantry needed meat, and hunting cleared his mind when the memories became too loud. The sun climbed higher as Mason tracked deer through scrubland. The morning shadows retreated, and with them, the edges of his nightmare. Out here, with nothing but the rhythm of hooves and wind, he could almost believe himself free. The deer led him farther than usual into rough country of red rock and twisted juniper. By midday, he'd lost the trail and was considering turning back when he heard it, the distinctive yipping howl of coyotes. Not unusual in itself, but something in their tone raised the hair on Mason's neck. That wasn't a hunting call. It was excitement. They'd found prey. Mason urged his horse toward the sound, cresting a ridge that overlooked a shallow basin. The sight below froze the blood in his veins. A woman knelt in the dust, wrists bound to a wooden post, hammered into the earth. Her black hair hung loose around her shoulders, her buckskin dress torn and dirt-stained. Around her, a half-dozen coyotes circled, growing bolder with each pass. Mason didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, sighted on the largest coyote, and squeezed the trigger. The crack echoed across the basin. The animal dropped, and its companions scattered into the brush with startled yelps. The woman's head snapped up at the shot. Even at a distance, Mason could see the defiance in her posture, the way she straightened her spine despite her bonds. She didn't call for help, didn't scream or beg. She simply watched, alert and wary, as he descended the slope. He rode down quickly, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. Knife in hand, he approached cautiously. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice level. She said nothing, dark eyes tracking his every movement. Up close, Mason could see she was Apache high cheekbones, copper skin, the intricate beadwork on what remained of her dress. Rope burns scored her wrists where she'd struggled against her bonds. Despite the dirt and blood, there was a quiet dignity in her bearing that struck him. Mason knelt and cut through the ropes. As the last strand gave way, the woman sagged forward. He caught her reflexively, surprised at how light she felt against his chest, how fragile despite her fierce expression. "Can you stand?" he asked. She pulled back, steadying herself with obvious effort. A trickle of blood ran from a cut above her eye. Her lips were cracked from thirst. "Yes," she said, the single English word carrying both strength and wariness. Mason offered his canteen. She hesitated, then took it with hands that trembled slightly. Instead of drinking deeply, as he expected, She took only a small sip before returning it. "You need more than that," he said. Her voice came low, rough, with thirst yet steady. "I take only what I must." The restraint surprised him. Most in her place would have drained the canteen. Mason studied her face, young, perhaps early 20s, but with eyes that had seen too much. "Who did this to you?" She didn't answer, gaze shifting to the ridge where the coyotes had disappeared. "They'll come back," Mason said, following her look. "We need to go." "Why help me?" she finally asked, words precise, despite her accent. Mason had no simple answer. Because it was right. Because the memory of another Apache, a child he couldn't save, still haunted him. Because no one deserves to die like that, he said instead, gesturing toward his horse. "Can you ride?" She nodded once, decisive. "What's your name?" he asked, helping her into the saddle. Again that measuring look, as if weighing whether his question deserved an answer. "Tyen," she finally said. Mason nodded. "Mason Reed." He swung up behind her, feeling her stiffen at the proximity. "My ranch is about 2 hours' ride. We'll get you patched up there." They rode in silence, Tyen sitting rigid before him, neither leaning into his support nor pulling away. As they traveled, Mason noted how her eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert for danger, even in her weakened state. The terrain changed scrubland, giving way to scattered juniper and pine. Shadows lengthened as afternoon wore on. Mason found himself increasingly aware of the woman sharing his saddle, the faint herbal scent of her hair, the controlled rhythm of her breathing, the way she unconsciously leaned into turns before he guided the horse. "You ride well," he observed, breaking their long silence. "I was riding before I could walk," she replied, then fell silent again. The simple exchange seemed to ease some of the tension between them. Not trust Mason doubted Tyen trusted anyone easily, but perhaps a tentative truce. Late afternoon shadows stretched across the land when they reached his cabin. Mason helped Tyen dismount, steadying her when her legs buckled beneath her. "Let's get those wrists cleaned up," he said, leading her inside. The cabin's interior was sparse, but neat stone fireplace, wooden table with 2 chairs, narrow bed against the far wall shelves holding books and supplies. Mason guided Tyen to a chair and lit the lamp, then gathered bandages and a bottle of whiskey from a cabinet. Tyen watched his movements, still wary, but no longer poised for immediate flight. Her gaze took in every detail of his home, lingering on the books, the carefully arranged supplies, the single plate and cup beside the wash basin signs of a solitary existence. Mason pulled the second chair close to hers. "This will sting," he warned, pouring a measure of whiskey onto a clean cloth. He reached for her wrist. She flinched, pulling back. "I just want to clean the cuts," he explained, voice softening. "You'll scar bad if you don't." Tyen studied him for a moment, then slowly extended her hands. The rope burns were angry and raw skin broken in places. Mason dabbed them gently with the whiskey-soaked cloth, careful not to press too hard. She winced once, but made no sound. "You've got grit," he murmured. "Most would be screaming." Her lips pressed into a line. "Screaming feeds the wolves." The simplicity of the answer chilled him. Mason wrapped clean bandages around her wrists, tying them snug. His fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary, struck by the contrast between the delicacy of her bones and the strength he sensed within her. "Are you hungry?" he asked when he'd finished. Tyen nodded, the first unguarded response she'd given. Mason prepared a simple meal, dried venison beans and cornbread from his morning baking. He noticed how Tyen watched each movement, memorizing the layout of his cabin, noting the placement of doors and windows. The behavior of someone who expected to need an escape route. They ate in silence. Mason didn't press for conversation, recognizing the exhaustion in her drooping shoulders. When they'd finished, he gathered the plates and nodded toward his bed. "You can sleep there tonight. I'll take the chair." Suspicion flashed across her face. "I won't hurt you," he said, understanding her concern. "You have my word." "A white man's word," she said, the first hint of bitterness in her tone. Mason couldn't fault her skepticism. "Yes, for whatever that's worth to you." Surprisingly, his honesty seemed to reassure her. She moved to the bed, sitting on its edge, still watching him. "I'll be right here if you need anything," Mason said, settling into the chair by the fireplace, rifle propped beside him. "Try to rest." Tyann didn't lie down immediately. She sat motionless, staring into the fire's embers. Mason pulled his journal from his shirt, intending to write, but stopped when he noticed her attention shift to the book. "Just thoughts," he explained, running a weathered hand over the leather cover. "You write? Every day?" she asked. Mason nodded. "Helps clear my head." "Of what?" He looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "Things I can't forget." Understanding passed between them, a recognition of shared burdens, though their stories remained untold. "My people believe writing steals power from memory," Tyann said, surprising him with the longest statement she'd offered. "Words on paper are shadows. True stories live in the heart." "Maybe that's why I write them down," Mason admitted. "Some memories have too much power." Tyann considered this, head tilted slightly. "Your memories have teeth." The metaphor struck Mason with unexpected force. "Yes," he said softly. "They do." She finally lay down, pulling the rough blanket over herself, facing the wall. Her breathing gradually slowed, but Mason suspected she wasn't truly sleeping, just resting while remaining alert. He opened his journal and began to write by the fire's dying light. "Found an Apache woman today tied up as coyote bait. Who would do such a thing? She says her name is Tyann. Doesn't trust me, which is wise. Something in her eyes reminds me of—" Mason paused, pen hovering over the page. "Reminds me of the child from Broken Ridge." The thought had come unbidden, and he couldn't explain it. There was no logical connection. That child would be barely 14 now, not a grown woman. Yet something in Tyann's defiant gaze stirred memories he'd tried to bury. He closed the journal without finishing the thought. Some things were better left unwritten, even in pages no one else would read. Outside, an owl called into the darkness. Mason stared into the dying fire and prepared for another sleepless night. Mason woke with a start, neck stiff from sleeping upright in the chair. Pale dawn light filtered through the window. The bed was empty, blanket neatly folded. His hand moved instinctively to his rifle before he spotted Tyann by the stove, her back to him, stirring something in his cast-iron pot. The domestic scene was so unexpected, it took him a moment to process. She turned at his movement. "You had coffee," she said simply, as if preparing breakfast for a stranger were the most natural thing in the world. Mason nodded, stretching cramped muscles. "You speak English well." "Mission school, before they closed it." She poured the coffee into 2 cups, handing him one. "The sisters taught us to read, write, to be civilized." The last word carried a weight of irony. "What happened to the school?" Mason asked, accepting the cup. Tyann's expression darkened. "Burned, like many things." The information hung between them, another piece of the puzzle that was Tyann. Mason sipped his coffee strong, exactly as he made it himself. "How are your wrists?" Tyann extended her hands, showing the clean bandages. "Better." They sat at the table, in awkward silence settling between them. Mason studied her in the morning light. With rest and food, color had returned to her face. Her movements were more fluid, less guarded. Despite the circumstances of their meeting, There was a natural grace to her presence that made the cabin feel less empty than it had in years. "Who tied you to that post?" he asked finally. Tyann's expression closed. "Men who want what I carry." "And what's that?" She touched a small leather pouch hanging from a cord around her neck. "Truth." Before Mason could ask her to elaborate, hoofbeats approached outside. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Tyann tensed, eyes darting to the windows. "Stay here," Mason ordered, moving to the door. He cracked it open, peering out. 4 riders approached his cabin, dust rising behind them. The lead rider wore a long black coat. Despite the Arizona heat, his hat pulled low. Something about his posture, the way he sat his horse, sent a chill down Mason's spine. "Get under the bed," he whispered to Tyann. "Now." To his relief, she didn't argue, slipping silently across the floor and disappearing beneath the narrow frame. Mason closed his journal on the table, placing a cup atop it casually, then stepped onto the porch, rifle held loose but ready. The riders halted 20 paces out. Their leader nudged his horse forward, and Mason's blood froze in his veins. Victor Blackwood. 7 years had changed him. Gray streaked his once black hair. New scars crossed the face, Mason remembered, including a puckered bullet wound on his left cheek. But the cold eyes were unmistakable, the same eyes that had stared down the barrel of a pistol at Broken Ridge. "Morning, friend," Blackwood called, voice carrying the same commanding tone Mason remembered. "Might we trouble you for some water? Been riding since dawn." Mason forced his expression to remain neutral, grateful for the beard that hid much of his face. Blackwood showed no sign of recognition, no indication he remembered the lieutenant he'd shot and left for dead. "Pumps around back," Mason replied, voice deliberately gruff. "Help yourselves." Blackwood dismounted with fluid grace despite his age. His companions, hard-faced men with the look of hired guns, remained mounted, hands resting near holstered weapons. "Obliged," Blackwood said, approaching. His coat parted slightly, revealing a star pinned to his vest. "Sheriff." The irony would have made Mason laugh if his heart weren't hammering against his ribs. Blackwood studied the cabin, taking in the modest surroundings. "You live out here alone, Mr. Reed," Mason answered, using his real surname as a challenge Blackwood didn't seem to recognize. "And yes, just me. Cattle business. Some. Mostly hunt and trade." Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. "Seen any Apache in these parts recently?" Mason kept his expression neutral. "Just passing bands. They keep their distance, I keep mine. Wise policy." Blackwood smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "We're tracking a particular Apache woman. Fugitive. Dangerous." "What did she do?" Mason asked, leaning against the doorframe, the picture of casual disinterest, while his mind raced, calculating distances, angles, who would shoot first if this went wrong. "Murdered her white husband. Stole valuable property." Blackwood's gaze sharpened. "Tall, early 20s. Would have come through here yesterday or the day before." The lie came easily. "Haven't seen anyone, Apache or otherwise." Blackwood studied him, searching for deception. Something in the man's gaze made Mason's skin crawl, the look of a predator assessing prey. "If you do," Blackwood said finally, "don't approach her. She carries the eagle's curse." "The what?" "Old Apache superstition. They believe some of their women can call on animal spirits." Blackwood's mouth twisted. "This one, well, let's just say those who help her tend to meet unfortunate ends." One of Blackwood's men shifted in his saddle. "Sheriff, we should move on if we want to check the canyon before nightfall." Blackwood raised a hand, silencing him without looking away from Mason. "I know these parts well, Mr. Reed. Served at Fort Wingate before taking the badge. Seen things that would turn most men's blood cold." I'll keep that in mind, Mason said evenly. Blackwood reached into his coat, extracting a folded paper that he handed to Mason. $200 to anyone who brings information leading to her capture, dead or alive. Mason unfolded the paper, a crude wanted poster with a rough sketch of a woman's face. The features were generic enough that many Apache women might match the description, but Mason recognized the distinctive beadwork pattern drawn on the dress collar, the same pattern Tyen wore. "I'll keep an eye out," he said, refolding the paper and tucking it into his pocket. Blackwood nodded, turning toward the water pump. He paused, glancing back. "That's a fine rifle. Army issue, isn't it?" Mason's grip tightened imperceptibly. "Bought it off a veteran passing through. Said he had no use for it after the war." "Indeed." Blackwood's eyes lingered on Mason's face, searching for something. "War changes men, makes them forget who they are, what they stand for." "Suppose it does," Mason agreed carefully. Blackwood smiled again, that same empty expression. "Well, we won't trouble you further, Mr. Reed. Good day to you." Mason watched them water their horses. Every muscle tensed, for the moment Blackwood might suddenly remember, might turn with recognition blazing in his eyes. But the moment never came. They mounted and rode off, dust swallowing their figures. Only when they were specks on the horizon did Mason return inside, closing the door firmly behind him. "You can come out," he said. Tyen slid from beneath the bed, rising to her feet with quiet dignity, despite the indignity of hiding. "You know him," she said, not a question. Mason turned to her, debate warring within him. Deny it, admit the truth. Before he could decide, Tyen continued. "His name is Blackwood. He hunts me for what I carry. He said you killed your husband, stole property." A flash of anger crossed Tyen's face, the most emotion she'd shown since they met. "I have never married, and what I carry cannot be stolen, only returned." She stepped closer, voice lowering. "I saw how you looked at him, with hate, with fear." Mason met her gaze. "We've met when another life." Mason turned away, unwilling to delve into those memories. Tyen moved to stand before him, blocking his retreat. "If you know Blackwood, you are either his friend or his enemy." "Which enemy?" Mason admitted. "Though he doesn't seem to remember me." "He will," Tyen said with certainty. "Men like Blackwood never truly forget those who cross them." Mason pulled the wanted poster from his pocket, showing it to her. $200 says he's serious about finding you. Would you collect it?" she challenged, chin lifting. "No." The answer came without hesitation, surprising them both with its certainty. Tyen studied him, something shifting in her gaze. She reached for the leather pouch at her neck, hesitated, then untied it. From within, she extracted folded papers, yellowed with age edges, worn soft from handling. "This is what he hunts," she said, placing them on the table. "This is what men like him fear." Mason moved closer, examining the papers without touching them. Maps, documents with official seals, lists of names, dates. "What is all this?" "Proof," Tyen said simply. "Proof of stolen land, broken treaties, names of those who profit from Apache blood." Her voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "My father was chief record keeper for our tribe. Before he died, he entrusted these to me." Mason looked up sharply. "Blackwood's name is here. His and many others. Men who wear stars on their chests while making fortunes from stolen land." She traced a finger down one of the documents. "This map shows Apache territory as agreed in the Treaty of 1868. This one shows what remains today. This list names those who acquired the land between." The implications sank in slowly. This wasn't about a single murder or theft. These papers could implicate dozens of officials, expose years of corruption and violence. "How long has he been hunting you?" Mason asked. "3 moons, since the last raid on our settlement." Tyen's voice faltered for the first time. "They killed many. I escaped with these." Something in her tone made Mason look closer. "Your family." Tyen turned away, facing the window. For a long moment, she didn't speak. When she did, her voice was barely audible. "I have no family. Not anymore." The simple statement carried the weight of mountains. Mason wanted to offer comfort, but knew no words could possibly suffice. Instead, he asked, "Where were you taking these papers?" "To a man called Judge Hamilton in Silver Rock. I was told he might listen." Mason's mind raced. If Blackwood had tracked her this far, he wouldn't give up easily. The man, Mason remembered, never left a mission unfinished, never forgave a slight. "You can't stay here," he said finally. "He'll be back." "Where would I go?" Tyen asked, a rare vulnerability showing through her composed exterior. "All safe places for my people are gone." Mason ran a hand through his hair, considering their options. Each was worse than the last. Hide her Blackwood would tear apart the countryside. Help her escape. They'd be tracked. Turn her in. The thought didn't merit consideration. "Silver Rock," he said finally. "If Judge Hamilton is as honest as you've heard, he's our best chance." Why would a white judge believe an Apache woman? A fair question. Mason had no answer that would satisfy her or himself. Instead, he asked, "Do you have somewhere else to go?" Tyen's silence was answer enough. "Then we'll leave tomorrow," Mason decided. "First light." She questioned. Mason met her gaze steadily. "I'm not letting you face Blackwood alone." "Why?" The simple question carried weight, demanding honesty. Mason could have offered many reasons: basic decency, the injustice of her situation, his own hatred for Blackwood. But what emerged was simpler, truer. "Because some debts can't be repaid," he said quietly. "But that doesn't mean we stop trying." Tyen studied him with those dark, knowing eyes, as if peering into his soul. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded once agreement, and something like respect. "Until dawn, then." That night, Mason prepared for their journey with methodical care. He cleaned his rifle and revolver, packed provisions, filled canteens. Tyen watched him work, occasionally offering suggestions from her place by the fire. "The mountains would be safer than the valley road," she said as he studied his crude map. "Longer, though. Blackwood will watch the roads." Mason nodded, conceding the point. Mountains it is. As the evening deepened, an unusual peace settled between them, the quiet understanding of two people united by common purpose, if not common past. Mason found himself talking more than usual, explaining his preparations, asking her opinion. Tyen's responses remained brief, but engaged her initial wariness, giving way to cautious cooperation. After their meal, Mason retrieved his journal, as had become his habit. This time, Tyen watched him openly as he wrote. "What do you write about?" she asked, breaking a long silence. Mason paused, pen hovering over paper. "Memories, mostly. Things I'm afraid to forget." "Good memories." He shook his head. "Not many of those." Tyen moved closer, sitting opposite him at the table. In the lamplight, her face appeared younger, revealing the girl she must have been before hardship had carved its lines into her expression. "You carried a child," she said suddenly. "At Broken Ridge." Mason's pen froze mid-stroke. The journal slipped from his fingers, spilling ink across the page. "How do you speak in your sleep?" Tyen's eyes held his unwavering. Last night, when the nightmare came, you called out, "I've got you. I'll keep you safe." Mason's throat tightened. It was a long time ago. Not to you, she observed. To you, it is still happening. She reached for his left hand unexpectedly, turning it palm up. Her fingers traced the calluses there, the old scars. These marks, she said, touching a particular pattern of calluses. From rifle drills. My father showed me how to recognize a soldier's hands. Mason withdrew his hand gently. That was another life. No, Tyen said with surprising firmness. One life only. The past follows like shadow follows light. The conversation unsettled him, stirring memories Mason preferred to keep buried. He retrieved his journal, closing it with deliberate care. We should get some sleep, he said. Long ride tomorrow. Tyen didn't press, but her gaze remained knowing. She returned to her place by the fire, leaving Mason with the uncomfortable sensation of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. He offered her the bed again, but she refused, wrapping herself in a blanket near the hearth. Mason suspected her choice was strategic, closer to both door and window, better positioned to hear approaching danger. Sleep eluded him. Mason lay on his narrow bed, listening to the cabin's familiar creaks, Tyen's soft breathing, distant coyote calls. His mind circled relentlessly, replaying Blackwood's visit, calculating risks, remembering another time when he'd tried and failed to save an Apache life. Sometime in the darkest hours, Mason rose, moving silently to his small bookshelf. Behind a row of practical manuals, he kept a slim wooden box, its brass hinges tarnished with age. He opened it carefully, removing a folded piece of buckskin. Mason returned to his bed, unfolding the soft hide in the moonlight that spilled through the window. Upon it, he had sketched a small handprint, the impression left in dust on his uniform by the child he'd tried to save at Broken Ridge. Beside it, he'd drawn the distinctive tribal marking he'd noticed on her arm, a pattern of 3 triangles representing eagle's wings. For years he'd kept this memento, this reminder of his failure and his promise. Now, with Tyen sleeping across the room, that long-ago vow stirred within him. He had failed one Apache life. He would not fail another. Mason carefully refolded the buckskin, returning it to its box, and finally drifted into restless sleep. He dreamed of eagles circling over burning villages, of a child's hand in his, of Blackwood's cold smile as he raised his pistol. And throughout it all, eyes watching, knowing, judging, forgiving. Dawn had barely broken when Tyen woke him already dressed and ready. She had prepared coffee and packed her few belongings while he slept. You move quietly, Mason observed, impressed, despite himself. Silent feet outlive loud boots, she replied, the Apache saying, rolling naturally off her tongue. They ate a simple breakfast, speaking little. Mason felt oddly reluctant to leave his cabin, this sanctuary he had built, but knew it had already been compromised. Blackwood had found him once. He would return. As they saddled the horses, Mason's bay gelding and a sturdy pinto he used for pack trips, Tyen suddenly stilled, head tilting as if listening. What is it? Mason asked, hand moving to his rifle. Tyen pressed her palm to the earth, eyes closing briefly. Riders, she said. Coming fast. Mason strained his ears but heard nothing. Yet he'd seen enough of Tyen to doubt her senses. How far? Close. Very close. As if summoned by her words, dust rose on the horizon, riders approaching from the east, moving at a gallop. Blackwood, Mason muttered, recognizing the black-coated figure in the lead. How did he know? Tyen's eyes met his, a shadow passing through them. The eagle's curse. It followed me here. Mason wanted to dismiss the superstition, But something in her tone gave him pause. "We need to go. Now." They mounted quickly, spurring their horses toward the western ridge, where the mountains offered cover. Behind them, shouts carried on the wind as their flight was spotted. "Ride," Mason called, urging his horse faster. They thundered across the scrubland, Tyen slightly ahead, her lighter weight allowing her mount greater speed. Mason glanced back, gauging the distance to their pursuers, 5 riders closing fast, dust billowing behind them. The mountains loomed closer, jagged peaks promising sanctuary. If they could reach the tree line, the dense pine forest would conceal their passage, make tracking more difficult. A gunshot cracked behind them. The bullet whined overhead, well wide of its mark, but close enough to convey intent. "They're in range," Mason called to Tyen. "Keep low." She obeyed instantly, flattening herself against her horse's neck. Another shot rang out, this one kicking up dirt to their right. The tree line was tantalizingly close now, dark pines stretching toward them. Another 100 yards. Mason's horse suddenly stumbled, recovering quickly, but losing precious momentum. He felt the animal's gait change, favoring its right foreleg. Not lamed, but injured, perhaps. A stone or prairie dog hole. "Keep going," he shouted to Tyen, who had glanced back at his slowing pace. "I'll hold them off." For a moment, he thought she would continue alone, the logical choice, the survival choice. Instead, she wheeled her horse around, returning to his side. "We band together," she said, the simple declaration leaving no room for argument. Mason wanted to protest, but knew it would waste precious seconds. He nodded, and they pushed forward, his limping mount struggling to maintain speed. They reached the first pines as another volley of shots rang out. Bullets splintered bark around them as they plunged into the forest's relative safety. The dense canopy swallowed them, green shadows replacing harsh sunlight. "This way," Tyen called, guiding them along a game trail barely visible to Mason's eye. They wound deeper into the forest, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter as the terrain grew more challenging. Mason's horse labored up the increasing incline, its injury slowing them further. After 20 minutes of hard riding, they reached a small clearing beside a rocky outcropping. Mason reined in, sliding from the saddle to examine his horse's leg. The animal's fetlock was swollen but not broken, a minor sprain that would heal with rest. Rest they couldn't afford. "They'll follow our trail," he said, looking back the way they had come. Tyen dismounted, moving to the edge of the clearing. "Yes," she agreed. "But we can make it harder." She led them to a shallow stream that cut through the forest, instructing Mason to ride in the water to mask their tracks. For over an hour they followed the stream's winding course, climbing higher into the mountains. When they finally emerged, the forest had thinned, revealing a panoramic view of the valley below. Mason's cabin was a distant speck, barely visible through his spyglass. Dark smoke rose from its direction. "They burned it," Mason said, a hollow feeling spreading in his chest. The small sanctuary he'd built, gone. Tyen stood beside him, her expression solemn. "I am sorry. This is my burden, not yours." Mason lowered the spyglass. "Just a cabin," he said, though they both knew it was more. "Your home, a hiding place," he corrected. "Nothing more." Tyen studied him, seeing through the lie. "Sometimes what we build to hide becomes the only place we feel seen." The insight struck Mason with unexpected force. Before he could respond, a sound from the ridge below drew their attention. Movement among the trees, the flash of sunlight on metal. "They found our trail," Tyen whispered. "Let's move," Mason replied, helping her back onto her horse. "We're not done yet." As they rode deeper into the mountains, Mason felt something shift within him, a resolve hardening like steel being tempered. Blackwood had taken his career, his peace, and now his home. But he would not take Tyen. Not while Mason Reed still breathed. The day wore on, sun climbing high, then beginning its slow descent. They picked their way through increasingly rugged terrain, following ridgelines where possible to avoid leaving clear tracks. Mason's horse struggled but continued gamely its gait, improving slightly as they maintained a slower pace. By late afternoon, they had put significant distance between themselves and their pursuers, though Mason knew it was only temporary. Blackwood was a hunter by nature and by training. He would follow. They paused in a protected hollow to rest the horses and eat a cold meal. The high country spread around them, vast and ancient. "How far to Silver Rock?" Tyen asked, studying the distant horizons. 3 days' hard ride," Mason replied. "Longer with my horse injured." Tyen nodded, absorbing this information with characteristic calm. "Blackwood will not give up." "No," Mason agreed. "He never does." A comfortable silence settled between them as they ate. Mason found himself studying Tyen's profile against the mountain backdrop, struck again by the strange sense of familiarity he couldn't place. "You said Blackwood mentioned an eagle's curse," Tyen said suddenly. "What did he mean?" Mason recalled the conversation. "He said it was an Apache superstition. Something about women who can call on animal spirits." Tyen's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. "And you believe this?" "I believe Blackwood fears you," Mason answered carefully. "Whether it's for your papers or some superstition doesn't matter much to me." She seemed to weigh his response, then slowly extended her right wrist, turning it to reveal the underside. There, partially hidden beneath her sleeve, was a tattoo, 3 triangular shapes arranged like wings. "The mark of Eagle Clan," she explained. "Those born under Eagle Moon, blessed with Eagle's sight." Mason stared at the marking, blood rushing in his ears. The same symbol he had sketched on buckskin, the same pattern he had seen on a child's arm 7 years ago. "I've seen this before," he said, voice barely audible. Tyen withdrew her arm, covering the mark. "Many Apache carry clan symbols. Know this exact one." Mason's mind raced, connecting impossible dots. "At a village, years ago." Tyen's expression closed, becoming unreadable. "Many villages have burned Mason Reed. Many marks have been lost." Before he could press further, a sound from the ridge above silenced them both. The snap of a twig, clear and deliberate in the mountain quiet. They exchanged glances, rising in unison. Mason drew his rifle, motioning for Tyen to move behind him. "Blackwood," she whispered. Mason shook his head. The approach was too noisy for Blackwood's skilled trackers. Either someone else was in these mountains or— "It's a trap," he realized suddenly. "Too obvious. They want us to run east toward the clearing where they're waiting." Tyen nodded, her understanding eyes scanning their surroundings. "There," she pointed to a narrow gap between boulders. "It leads down to the valley." Mason hesitated. "It could be what they expect." "Trust me," Tyen said, eyes meeting his. "Eagle sees what wolf misses." The cryptic statement hung between them. Mason nodded, decision made. They moved silently toward the gap, leading their horses with careful steps. The passage proved treacherously narrow, forcing them to proceed in single file. Loose stones clattered beneath their feet, each sound magnified in the confined space. Mason winced at the noise, certain it would give away their position. They emerged onto a steep slope overlooking a different valley than the one they'd left. Below, a river wound like a silver ribbon through stands of aspen and pine. "We follow the water," Tyen said with certainty. "It will hide our trail." As they descended toward the river, Mason kept watch on the ridgeline above. No pursuit appeared, but he knew better than to believe they'd escaped. Blackwood was too thorough, too determined. The sun hung low when they reached the river, its cold waters rushing with spring runoff. They led their horses into the shallows, following the current downstream. The icy flow numbed Mason's legs, but he welcomed the discomfort. It kept him alert-focused. As dusk gathered, they found a small island in the river's center, a rise of land just large enough for them and their horses, sheltered by a stand of willows. The location offered protection on all sides, with clear views of both banks. "We'll rest here tonight," Mason decided, helping Tyann from her horse. They made a cold camp, unwilling to risk a fire that might be spotted. Mason shared jerky and dried fruit from his saddlebags, while Tyann found edible roots near the water's edge. Darkness fell swiftly in the mountains, stars appearing in brilliant profusion across the clear sky. Mason arranged their blankets in the shelter of the willows, then settled with his back against a fallen log rifle across his knees. Tyann sat beside him, closer than she'd allowed before. Whether for warmth or companionship, Mason couldn't tell, but he welcomed her presence. "My people believe the stars are the campfires of those who have gone before," she said softly, breaking their long silence. "They watch over us, guide our paths." Mason looked up at the vast expanse. "That's a comforting thought. And you, what do your people believe?" "I don't know anymore," Mason admitted. "I stopped asking those questions a long time ago." Tyann studied him, starlight reflecting in her dark eyes. "The eagle does not forget how to fly, even when its wings are broken." The metaphor hung between them, an offering Mason wasn't sure how to accept. Instead, he asked, "This eagle's curse Blackwood mentioned, is it real?" Tyann's gaze returned to the stars. "Our women do not curse. We carry, we preserve, we remember." She paused. "But yes, some are born with gifts. The ability to understand animal ways, to speak without words. And you have this gift." A small smile curved her lips. "Perhaps Blackwood should worry less about curses and more about the truth I carry in these papers." Mason recognized the deflection but didn't press. Everyone had secrets, boundaries that shouldn't be crossed without invitation. "We should sleep," he said, adjusting his position against the log. "I'll take first watch." Tyann nodded, wrapping herself in a blanket and lying down nearby. Unlike previous nights, she positioned herself close to him, her trust a tangible thing in the narrow space between them. "Mason," she said softly, just as he thought she'd fallen asleep. "Yes. Thank you for burning your life to save mine." The simple gratitude caught him off guard. "I didn't have much of a life to burn," he admitted. "Then perhaps this journey will give you a new one." Before he could respond, she had turned away, her breathing gradually slowing into the rhythm of sleep. Mason stared into the darkness, her words echoing in his mind. A new life. The concept seemed as distant as the star fires overhead. For 7 years, he'd existed rather than lived, hiding from his past, rather than facing it. Now circumstances had thrust him back into the world, back into purpose. As the night deepened around them, Mason found himself studying Tyann's sleeping form, wondering at the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. Was it truly chance that had led him to that basin, or something more, some debt the universe demanded be paid? He didn't have answers, but for the first time in years, Mason Reed found himself looking forward to tomorrow, curious about what it might bring, rather than dreading its arrival. In the shelter of river and willows, watched over by ancient star fires, they rested. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But tonight, they had found a moment of peace in their flight, a small island of calm in the storm of pursuit. Morning mist clung to the river like a ghostly shroud. Mason woke before dawn, rifle still cradled in his lap. Despite his intention to keep watch through the night, exhaustion had claimed him. He blinked away sleep, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Tien was already awake, kneeling at the water's edge. Her reflection rippled in the current. As she washed her face, the gentle motions almost ceremonial. She'd let her hair down the black length of it, cascading past her shoulders. In the half-light, with her guard momentarily lowered, she looked younger, unburdened. Mason watched silently, reluctant to intrude on her privacy. There was something sacred in the moment, a glimpse of who Tien might have been in a world without Blackwood, without burning villages. She sensed his gaze turning slightly. Their eyes met across the small island, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. "No sign of pursuit," she said, gathering her hair back into a practical braid. Mason nodded, rising stiffly. His muscles protested the night spent against the log-old wounds aching in the mountain chill. "We should move soon. Follow the river until it's safe to head east." Tien stood adjusting her buckskin dress with practiced movements. "The water runs clear today. Good sign. For what? Journey without blood." She gestured to the horses already grazing on the island's sparse vegetation. "Your horse's leg is better." Mason checked the animal's fetlock, surprised to find the swelling significantly reduced. "How did you know?" "I made a poultice last night. River moss and willow bark." At his questioning look, she added, "You sleep deeply for a man expecting pursuit." There was no reproach in her tone, but Mason felt it nonetheless. He should have stayed alert. 7 years of solitude had dulled his soldier's instincts, a dangerous weakness with Blackwood on their trail. "Thank you," he said simply, "for the horse, and for not leaving while I slept." The faintest smile touched her lips. Where would I go that Blackwood would not follow? They broke camp efficiently, leaving minimal trace of their presence. The river had risen slightly overnight, covering their tracks from the previous evening. Mason considered it a small mercy, as they led their horses back into the current, continuing downstream. The day warmed gradually, sun burning away the mist to reveal a clear blue sky. They traveled in companionable silence, alert for signs of danger. By midday, the river widened and grew shallower, forcing them onto the eastern bank, where the terrain opened into rolling foothills. Mason studied the landscape through his spyglass, searching for dust clouds or moving figures. Nothing but wind-stirred grass and the occasional deer. "Too quiet," Tien observed, echoing his unspoken concern. "Blackwood wouldn't give up so easily," Mason agreed. "He's playing a longer game." "What game?" "Waiting, watching the approaches to Silver Rock." Mason collapsed the spyglass, tucking it into his saddlebag. "He knows that's where we're headed." Tien considered this. "Then we find another way." They consulted Mason's map spread across his saddle. Silver Rock lay 3 days' ride southeast, a mining town nestled in the foothills where mountains gave way to desert. The main road followed river valleys, obvious and exposed. Here, Tien pointed to a section of the map where contour lines bunched together. Old Apache hunting trails. Difficult passage, but hidden. Mason raised an eyebrow. "You know these trails?" "My father showed me. Before—" She didn't finish the sentence. Mason studied her face, noting the shadow that crossed it at the mention of her father. Throughout their journey, Tien had revealed little about herself beyond the essential facts of her mission. Now, watching her trace the map with practiced fingers, he sensed an opening. "Tell me about him," he said gently. "Your father." Tien looked up, surprise flickering across her features. For a moment, he thought she might refuse. Then her expression softened. "He was Eagle Clan shaman," she said. "Keeper of stories and records. When other tribes lost their histories, to time or war ours remained because of men like my father. Pride warmed her voice. He could recite 300 years of tribal lineages from memory, could name every treaty made and broken. He sounds remarkable. He was. Tyann's gaze grew distant. When the white soldiers first came, he understood before others what would follow. He began recording everything, not just in memory but on paper, using the writing I taught him from mission school. "The documents you carry," Mason said. She nodded. "Maps showing our lands before treaties. Lists of officials who profited from each new boundary. Records of promises made in public and broken in private." Her fingers touched the pouch at her neck. "When the soldiers came for our village, he gave me these and told me to run. Said I was the only one who could move between worlds. And your mother died when I was young. Fever." Tyann folded the map with practiced movements. "My father raised me alone, taught me to be both Apache and something more. Said someday I would need both." The personal history explained much about Tyann, her quiet strength, her determination, her ability to navigate both worlds. Mason felt privileged to glimpse the person behind the stoic exterior. "He would be proud of you," he said simply. Tyann met his gaze, something vulnerable flickering in her dark eyes. "Perhaps, if we succeed." She mounted her horse in one fluid motion. "We should move. There is much ground to cover." They rode east, leaving the river behind. The terrain grew more challenging as they climbed narrow game trails winding through stands of aspen and pine. Tyann led the way, her keen eye picking out paths Mason would have missed entirely. By late afternoon, they had gained considerable elevation. The view stretched for miles, the river they'd followed, now a silver thread in the distance. Mason reined in at a rocky outcrop that offered both shelter and visibility. "We'll stop here," he decided. "Rest the horses before the final push." Tyann dismounted, scanning the horizon. "Storm coming," she observed, nodding toward distant clouds building in the west. Mason eyed the darkening sky. Another reason to find shelter. They made camp beneath the outcrop's overhang, the horses tethered nearby. This time, Mason risked a small fire shielded from view by the surrounding rocks. The warmth was welcome as the temperature dropped with the sun's descent. Tyann prepared a simple meal from their dwindling supplies, jerky softened in hot water mixed with wild onions she'd gathered along the trail. The result was surprisingly flavorful, reminding Mason how long it had been since he'd shared food prepared by another. "You learned to cook at the mission school?" he asked, accepting a second portion. "No, from my grandmother." Tyann's expression softened at the memory. "She said a woman who cannot feed herself and her family is always at another's mercy." Wise woman. She survived 3 wars and outlived 4 husbands. A rare smile touched Tyann's lips. She said stubborn women live longest. Mason found himself returning the smile. "Then you'll probably outlive us all." The moment of levity passed quickly as thunder rumbled in the distance. They finished their meal in silence, each lost in private thoughts as the storm approached. When it broke, the ferocity was stunning. Rain lashed against the rocks, wind howling through the pines. Lightning split the darkened sky, followed by crashes of thunder that seemed to shake the very mountain. Mason added wood to their fire, building it higher against the encroaching chill. Tyann sat close to the flames, knees drawn up, watching the storm with a mixture of respect and wariness. "Eagle Clan believes thunder is the voice of ancestors," she said, voice barely audible above the storm. "Warning or blessing, depending on when it comes." Which is this? Mason asked. She considered the question. Both, perhaps. They fell silent again, listening to the storm's fury. The small fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows against the rock wall. Outside their shelter, the world dissolved into chaos of wind and water. But here in this moment, they had found a strange peace. Mason found himself studying Tyann's profile in the firelight. The strong line of her jaw, the slight furrow between her brows, the way she held herself always alert, always ready. Yet, beneath that vigilance, he sensed something else. Not fear, but a bone-deep weariness. The exhaustion of someone who had carried a burden alone for too long. "When you asked about my nightmares," he said suddenly, "how did you know about the child from Broken Ridge?" Tyann's gaze remained on the fire. "You speak in your sleep. Names, places. The child you couldn't save. Yet you didn't ask. Some wounds need silence to heal." Mason nodded, understanding her restraint. Yet now, with the storm raging around them, the need for truth pressed upon him with sudden urgency. "I've never told anyone what really happened at Broken Ridge," he said, voice low. "Not the full truth." Tyann looked up, her expression open, but not demanding. "I will listen if you wish to speak." Mason took a deep breath. For years he had carried the burden alone, as if silence could somehow bury the memories. But here in this mountain shelter with storm raging outside, the truth seemed to demand voice. "It was supposed to be a routine patrol," he began. "Blackwood was my commanding officer. Said we had reports of hostile Apache raiding settlements along the border." The familiar tightness gripped his chest, but he pushed through it. "When we reached the village, I knew immediately something was wrong. These weren't raiders, just families. Women washing clothes, children playing. Lightning flashed momentarily, flooding their shelter with harsh light. Blackwood gave the order to attack anyway. Said they were harboring hostiles." Mason stared into the fire, seeing not flames, but burning hogans, falling bodies. "I refused, tried to stop it. Then I saw this child, a little girl, running from a burning dwelling. One of Blackwood's men had her in his sights." "You saved her," Tyann said softly. "I tried." Mason's voice roughened. "Got shot for my trouble. Blackwood himself. We fell into a ravine together, the girl and I." He touched his scarred shoulder unconsciously. "I passed out from blood loss. When I woke, she was gone. I searched for months afterward. Never found a trace." "Why?" Tyann's question was gentle but direct. "Why risk everything for one child?" The simple question cut to the heart of something Mason had never fully articulated, even to himself. "Because in that moment, she was everything," he said finally. "Everything worth saving. Everything worth being." He met Tyann's gaze. "And because I knew if I stood by and did nothing, I would never be whole again." Thunder crashed overhead, momentarily drowning all other sound. When it faded, a strange stillness settled between them. Tyann watched him with an intensity that seemed to peer into his very soul. "There is something I must show you," she said finally. She reached into her dress, drawing out the leather pouch that held her precious documents. From it she extracted something Mason hadn't seen before, a tarnished silver lieutenant's bar. "She kept her promise too," Tyann said, placing the bar in Mason's palm. The metal was warm from being carried close to her body. Mason stared at it, uncomprehending at first, then with dawning realization. "This was mine," he whispered. "From my uniform. But how?" He looked up, truly, seeing Tyann for the first time. The shape of her eyes, the determined set of her jaw. Most tellingly, the eagle mark on her wrist, the same symbol he had sketched on buckskin and kept all these years. "It's not possible," he breathed. "You would be—" "I was 7 when Broken Ridge burned," Tyen said quietly. "I am 22 now." Mason's mind reeled, struggling to reconcile the numbers. "That's 15 years. But I've only been at my cabin for 7, maybe 8 at most." Tyen's expression grew solemn. "Time passes differently for those between worlds, Mason Reed. Your wounds were grave. You lay unconscious for many days." "Days, not years," Mason protested. "Your body healed in days. Your spirit wandered longer." Tyen's voice held absolute certainty. "The Apache who found us took you to a medicine man. You were healing for nearly 2 years before you woke fully. By then, I had been sent to the mission school. When you began your search, I was already far away." Mason struggled to process her words. 2 years lost to unconsciousness or delirium. It seemed impossible. Yet, as he searched his memories, he found strange gaps, inconsistencies he'd never questioned. The cabin he'd built yet couldn't remember building. The way seasons seemed to blur together. "You're saying I lost track of time," he said slowly. "That I've been living in some kind of delusion." "Not delusion," Tyen corrected gently. "Protection. The mind shields itself from what it cannot bear, creates its own truth when the real one is too painful." Lightning flashed again, illuminating her face with stark clarity. In that instant, Mason saw Tyen not as she was, but as she had been, a small child, with terrified eyes clutching his uniform as they fell together into darkness. The vision passed as quickly as it had come, leaving him shaken, but somehow more complete, as if a missing piece had been restored. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" he asked, voice hoarse. "Would you have believed me?" Tyen countered. "Even now you doubt." She was right. Part of him still rejected her explanation, clinging to the timeline he'd lived by for so long. Yet another part recognized the truth in her words, the way they filled hollows in his understanding. "The eagle's curse," he murmured, recalling Blackwood's warning. "Is that what this is? Some kind of magic?" Tyen shook her head. "Not a curse, a gift. The ability to see beyond the veil most walk behind. To remember what others forget." She touched his hand lightly. "You saved me at Broken Ridge. I found you again because I never forgot your face." Mason looked down at the lieutenant's bar in his palm, then carefully returned it to her. "Keep it," he said, "until this is finished." Tyen nodded, tucking the silver bar back into her pouch. The gesture seemed to seal something between them, an acknowledgement of their shared past, their intertwined fates. Outside, the storm gradually began to subside. Rain still fell, but the thunder receded into the distance, rumbling like an old memory. Mason added the last of their wood to the fire, building it higher against the night's increasing chill. "Try to rest," he said. "I'll keep watch." This time he meant it. Sleep was the furthest thing from his mind as he sat with his back against the rock wall rifle across his knees, staring into the darkness beyond their shelter. 15 years since Broken Ridge. The knowledge settled over him like a heavy blanket, uncomfortable, yet impossible to remove. How much of what he thought he knew was real? How much fabricated by a mind unable to process trauma? More immediately, it meant Blackwood was far more dangerous than he had realized. The man had survived 15 years, risen to the position of sheriff, extended his influence. And all that time he'd been hunting Tyen, the lone witness to his crimes, now grown into a woman carrying documentary evidence of his corruption. No wonder he had burned Mason's cabin. No wonder he pursued them with such determination. It wasn't just about silencing one Apache woman. It was about preserving 15 years of power built on stolen land and buried atrocities. Dawn found Mason still awake, watching as first light touched the eastern horizon. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet pine and stone. Tyan stirred, rising from her blankets, with the fluid grace that continually surprised him. "You didn't sleep," she observed. "Too much to think about." She nodded understanding without need for elaboration. They broke camp quietly, saddling the horses as the sky brightened. Mason's gelding moved with only the slightest hint of yesterday's limp, another small blessing. As they prepared to depart, Tyen paused, head tilted in that now familiar listening posture. Mason tensed, hand moving to his rifle. "What do you hear?" "Horses," she said. "Many, coming from the south." Mason strained his ears, but heard nothing. Still, he had learned to trust Tyen's senses. How far? Far yet, but moving fast. Blackwood. Tyen shook her head slowly. Different rhythm. Not pursuit. More like patrol. They mounted quickly, leaving the shelter of the outcrop. From higher ground, Mason used his spyglass to scan the southern approaches. At first, he saw nothing but empty trail. Then movement horsemen emerging from a distant stand of pines. "Cavalry," he said, recognizing the formation even at a distance. "Full patrol, heading this way." "Friends of Blackwood?" Tyen asked, tension evident in her voice. "Possibly." Mason collapsed, the spyglass mind racing. "Or they might have no connection to him at all. Regular patrol from Fort Wingate, perhaps." "We cannot risk it." "No," he agreed. "We'll have to change course." They turned northeast away from the approaching soldiers, pushing their horses as fast as the rough terrain allowed. The trail narrowed, winding through stands of pine, so dense they were forced to proceed single file. Mason led the way, acutely aware that each passing minute brought the cavalry patrol closer to intersecting their path. By mid-morning, they had put several miles between themselves and the soldiers, but the rough country had slowed their progress toward Silver Rock. Mason reined in at the edge of a steep drop, studying the valley below. "We'll have to descend here," he said, not liking the exposed position it would put them in. "No other way around." Tyen surveyed the terrain with a practiced eye. "Too open. We would be seen. We don't have much choice. Unless..." Mason pointed to a distant plume of smoke rising from the valley floor, perhaps 3 miles east. "Homestead or ranch might offer shelter until the patrol passes." Tyen's expression grew wary. "Or they might turn us in for the reward." "True, but we're running out of options." They debated briefly before deciding the risk was necessary. Carefully, they picked their way down the steep slope, horses sliding on loose shale and damp earth from the night's storm. Once on level ground, they rode toward the smoke, staying close to the tree line for cover. As they approached, details emerged: a modest ranch house with attached barn, several corrals, a vegetable garden. A man worked in the yard, splitting wood with practiced strokes of an axe. He paused, sensing their presence, before they announced themselves. "That's far enough," he called, setting down the axe and reaching for a rifle propped against the chopping block. "State your business." Mason raised his hands to show they meant no harm. "Looking for shelter. Cavalry patrol in the area. Rather avoid them if possible." The man, tall, lean, with a silver-streaked beard framing a weather-beaten face, studied them with narrowed eyes. His gaze lingered on Tyen, recognition dawning. "Apache woman," he said. "Traveling with a white man. There's talk about you two." Mason's hand inched toward his sidearm. "What kind of talk?" "Depends who's doing the talking." The man shouldered his rifle but didn't aim it directly at them. "Sheriff Blackwood says you're dangerous." Killed some settlers up north." "And you believe him?" Mason asked carefully. The man spat into the dirt. "Blackwood's word ain't worth the air it rides on." He lowered the rifle slightly. "Name's James Redwood. Got no love for sheriffs or cavalry. You can rest your horses in the barn, but I want the full story before you leave." Relief washed through Mason. "Fair enough. One condition," Redwood added, eyes fixed on Tyen. "That mark on your wrist. Show it to me." Tyen tensed, but slowly extended her arm, turning it to reveal the eagle tattoo. Redwood nodded, as if confirming something long suspected. "Eagle Clan," he said softly, "like my wife was." The simple statement changed everything. Redwood beckoned them forward, his posture relaxing. "Come on, then. Cavalry usually passes through by sundown. You can be on your way after." They followed Redwood to the barn, a solid structure that smelled of hay and leather. Inside, he helped them unsaddle their horses, moving with the easy competence of a man accustomed to livestock. "Your wife," Tyen said cautiously. "She was Apache, Sierra Band." Redwood confirmed, hanging their saddles on a rack. "Kalina was her name. Finest silversmith in 3 territories." Pride and sorrow mingled in his tone. "Been gone 6 years now." "I'm sorry for your loss," Mason offered. Redwood acknowledged the words with a nod. "Wasn't sickness took her. Was men like Blackwood." His expression hardened. "Mining company wanted land our settlement was on. Blackwood led the raid, called it a peacekeeping action." The familiar pattern sent a chill through Mason. How many died? 38. Women and children included. Redwood's hands stilled on the bridle he was hanging. "I was away trading in Silver Rock. Came back to ashes." The parallels to Broken Ridge were unmistakable. Mason exchanged glances with Tyen, silent understanding passing between them. This was no coincidence. This was Blackwood's method. Eliminate indigenous communities standing in the way of profitable land deals. File reports claiming hostile action. Repeat. "We've seen his work before," Mason said grimly. Redwood turned, studying them with new interest. "Figured as much way you're running." He gestured toward the house. "Come on. Food first, then talk. Been too long since I had company that wasn't trying to sell me something or take what's mine." The ranch house interior was simple but well-maintained, polished wood floors, sturdy furniture walls adorned with a curious blend of white and Apache craftsmanship. Mason noticed Tyen's attention drawn to a display of silver jewelry mounted in a wooden frame. Delicate pieces showing remarkable artistry. "Kalina's work," Redwood said, following her gaze. "Only pieces I managed to save." "Beautiful," Tyen said softly, genuine appreciation in her voice. She reached out, fingers hovering near, but not touching a silver pendant shaped like an eagle in flight. "She made that one for our 5th anniversary," Redwood said, voice softening with memory. "Said the eagle watches over long journeys." He carefully removed the pendant from its display, offering it to Tyen. "You should have it. Kalina would want her work to serve Eagle Clan again." Tyen hesitated, clearly moved by the gesture. "I cannot take what little you have left of her." "Not taking," Redwood insisted. "Continuing. That's how our people survive, through what continues." He pressed the pendant into her palm. "Besides, looks like you're on a journey that needs watching over." The moment held a sacred quality, a connection forged through shared loss and understanding. Mason felt privileged to witness it, to see the walls both Tyen and Redwood maintained against the world briefly lowered in recognition of kinship. Redwood moved to the kitchen area, stoking the cook stove. "Hope you don't mind venison stew. Made it fresh this morning." They sat at Redwood's table, the simple meal more satisfying than anything Mason had eaten in recent memory. Perhaps it was the warmth of the house after days on the trail, or perhaps it was the unexpected respite from constant vigilance. Whatever the cause, he found himself relaxing slightly, savoring both the food and the momentary safety. As they ate, Redwood asked few questions, seemingly content to observe his unexpected guests. Only when they'd finished did he lean back, fixing them with a direct gaze. "Now," he said, "that story you promised." Mason glanced at Tyen, who gave a slight nod. He began with Broken Ridge, keeping details spare but honest. The massacre, his intervention. The years that followed, including his fragmented memories and recent revelations. Throughout, Redwood listened intently, interrupting only occasionally for clarification. When Mason finished, the rancher sat silent for a long moment, absorbing the tale. Finally, he turned to Tyen. "Those papers you carry," he said, "they're what Blackwood's really after, ain't they?" Tyen nodded. "They prove what he has done, what many have done. And you're taking them to Judge Hamilton in Silver Rock." "Yes." Redwood's expression grew troubled. "Hamilton's a good man, far as judges go. But he's just one man. Blackwood has friends, powerful friends. We don't have many options," Mason pointed out. "No," Redwood agreed. "Suppose you don't." He stood, moving to a cabinet in the corner. From it, he extracted a worn leather folder. "Might be I can help, though. Been collecting my own evidence these past years. Records of land transfers, names of officials involved in relocating Apache bands whose territory suddenly had mining value." He placed the folder on the table, opening it to reveal carefully organized documents. "Not enough on its own to bring down Blackwood, but combined with what you carry," he shrugged, "might tip the scales." Mason examined the papers with growing amazement. Birth and death certificates, property deeds, newspaper clippings reporting Indian troubles, alongside official dispatches describing peaceful settlements. Redwood had assembled a damning chronicle of systematic displacement and violence. "Why are you showing us this?" Tyen asked the question direct but not accusatory. Redwood's weathered face softened. "Been waiting 6 years for a chance to set things right. Starting to think it would never come." He looked at Tyen's eagle mark. "My Kalina believed Eagle Clan women were messengers that when they appeared, change followed. Maybe she was right." He closed the folder, pushing it toward Tyen. "Take it. Use it with your own. Make sure Hamilton sees everything." Tyen accepted the folder with solemn dignity. "Your wife would be proud." "Maybe so," Redwood said, voice rough with emotion he quickly masked. "Now cavalry patrol should be well past by nightfall. You can rest here until then. Spare room down the hall if you want proper sleep. Been a while since those beds saw use, but they're clean." The offer was tempting. Mason realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd slept in an actual bed. The narrow cot in his cabin hardly counted. Looking at Tyen, he saw the same weary longing reflected in her eyes. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "A few hours' rest would help considerably." Redwood nodded, rising from the table. "I'll keep watch. Any sign of trouble, I'll wake you." The spare room contained 2 narrow beds, a small dresser, and a window overlooking the eastern approach to the ranch. Mason checked the window's latch functional and the distance to the ground manageable if they needed to escape quickly. Old habits. "You should take the bed by the wall," he told Tyen. "Safer if there's trouble." She nodded, sitting on the edge of the designated bed. "Redwood is a good man," she observed. "Rare to find such among your people." "Among any people," Mason corrected gently. "Decent folks don't come in any particular color." "No?" she agreed, a faint smile touching her lips. They don't. Tyen fingered the silver pendant Redwood had given her, examining the delicate craftsmanship. Why do you think he trusts us? He has only just met us. Mason considered the question. Grief recognizes grief, he said finally. And purpose recognizes purpose. She looked up, dark eyes studying him with that penetrating gaze that always seemed to see more than he intended to reveal. And what does Tyen recognize in Mason? The direct question caught him off guard. He met her gaze, aware of the shortened distance between them, the private moment the room afforded, perhaps the first they'd had since their journey began. I hope, he said carefully, honor, resolve. Someone who keeps his promises, even if it takes 15 years. Those things, yes, she agreed softly, but also something you do not yet see in yourself. What's that? Healing. She touched the eagle pendant at her throat. The wound at Broken Ridge was not just in your shoulder, Mason Reed. It was in your spirit. Yet here you are fighting again, not running away. The observation struck him with unexpected force. He hadn't thought of himself as healing, surviving perhaps, but not healing. Yet Tyen saw it, recognized a transformation he himself couldn't perceive. Rest, she said, lying down on her bed. I will wake you if there is danger. Mason settled onto the other bed, still processing her words. Despite his intention to remain alert, exhaustion claimed him quickly. His last conscious thought was that perhaps Tyen was right. Perhaps, in helping her complete her mission, he was finally healing his own broken past. He dreamed of falling, tumbling down the ravine at Broken Ridge, a child clutched in his arms. But this time, as they landed, the child transformed into a woman with knowing eyes and an eagle mark on her wrist. She spoke words he couldn't understand, pointing toward a horizon where storm clouds gathered. Lightning flashed, revealing silhouettes of mounted men. Leading them was Blackwood, but his face kept shifting, becoming something inhuman, predatory. Mason jolted awake, heart pounding. Late afternoon light slanted through the window, painting golden rectangles on the wooden floor. Tyen was already up, standing by the window, watching something outside. What is it? He asked, swinging his legs over the bed's edge. Riders, she said without turning. Coming fast. Mason joined her at the window. In the distance, a dust cloud approached along the eastern trail. Too small for a cavalry patrol, too purposeful for casual travelers. Blackwood, he asked, though he already knew the answer. Tyen nodded. He found us. They moved quickly, gathering their few possessions. Mason strapped on his gun belt as they hurried down the hall toward the main room. Redwood met them at the door, rifle in hand, expression grim. Saw them, he said tersely. 5 riders, lead man in a black coat. Blackwood, Mason confirmed. How did he find us? Plenty of eyes in these mountains, Redwood replied. Trappers, prospectors, hunters. $200 buys a lot of attention. Mason peered through the front window. The riders were still a mile out, but approaching rapidly. We need to go, now. Won't make it, Redwood said, shaking his head. They'd run you down before you cleared the valley. He checked his rifle's action with practiced efficiency. Barn has a root cellar, hidden entrance behind the hay bales. Get down there. Stay quiet. We won't leave you to face Blackwood alone, Mason protested. Redwood's expression hardened. I've been waiting 6 years for that bastard to cross my property line. This isn't your fight anymore, it's mine. He'll kill you, Tyen said softly. Maybe, Redwood acknowledged, or maybe I'll finally get justice for Kalina. Either way, you two need to reach Silver Rock with those papers." He gestured toward the back door. "Go. I'll buy you time." The decision tore at Mason. Every instinct screamed against abandoning Redwood to face Blackwood alone. Yet the older man was right. Their mission had to take priority. Those documents might be the only chance to stop Blackwood permanently. "Take the North Trail when you leave," Redwood continued, pressing a folded map into Mason's hand. "Leads through the high country. Rough going, but Blackwood's men won't know it. Can get you to Silver Rock by tomorrow night if you push hard." Mason clasped the rancher's hand. "We'll make this count. I swear it." Redwood nodded, a grim smile touching his weathered face. "See that you do. Now, go." Tayen stepped forward suddenly, removing the silver eagle pendant from her neck. "This is your wife's work," she said, offering it to Redwood. "It should stay with you." Redwood shook his head gently, closing her fingers around the pendant. "Keep it. Where you're going, you'll need an eagle's eyes." He touched the mark on her wrist briefly. Kalina would be honored to have her work protect Eagle Clan again. The moment held a terrible finality. All three knew what Redwood's decision likely meant. Yet in his weathered face, Mason saw not fear, but a fierce determination, the look of a man who had found purpose after long years of waiting. "Go," Redwood said again, more urgently. "They're almost here." They slipped out the back door and across the yard to the barn. Inside, Mason quickly found the hidden entrance Redwood had described, a trapdoor concealed beneath hay bales leading to a narrow staircase. They descended into darkness, closing the door behind them. The root cellar was cool and damp, smelling of earth and preserved vegetables. Mason found a lantern hanging from a beam, lighting it to reveal a small, low-ceilinged space with rough-hewn shelves along the walls. Jars of preserves, sacks of root vegetables, and several casks of what smelled like whiskey occupied most of the available space. "Redwood comes prepared," Mason observed, keeping his voice low. "For siege," Tayen agreed, settling onto a wooden crate. "He has been waiting for this day." They sat in tense silence, straining to hear what transpired above. Minutes stretched interminably. Then, muffled voices, Redwood's distinctive drawl, followed by another that sent ice through Mason's veins. "Blackwood." The words were indistinct, but the tone was clear. Blackwood demanding, Redwood denying. The conversation grew heated. Footsteps moved across the barn floor overhead, directly above their hiding place. Mason's hand moved to his revolver, ready if the trapdoor should suddenly open. A shot rang out, the sound dampened by earth and timber. Then another. Silence followed, heavy and terrible. Mason and Tayen exchanged glances, the same fear reflected in their eyes. Had Redwood fallen, or had he managed to wound Blackwood? Impossible to know without revealing their position. More footsteps overhead, multiple sets now, men speaking in hushed tones. Something heavy being dragged across the floor. "Search everything," came Blackwood's voice, suddenly clear through a crack in the ceiling boards. "They're here somewhere. I can feel it." The search continued for what seemed hours. Boxes moved, hay scattered. At one point, boots stood directly above the trapdoor, so close Mason could see dust sifting through the boards. He held his breath, pistol aimed upward, knowing a single cough or shifting board would give them away. Finally, the footsteps receded. A horse whinnied outside. More muffled conversation. Then, gradually, silence returned. They waited another hour, neither daring to move or speak. When Mason finally extinguished the lantern and eased the trapdoor open, twilight had fallen. He peered cautiously into the barn, finding it empty, but in disarray, hay strewn about, tacks scattered, as if a whirlwind had passed through. "Clear," he whispered, helping Tayen up from the cellar. The silence that greeted them was unnerving. No birds sang, No insects chirped, only the soft rustle of wind through the open barn door. "Something's wrong," Tyann murmured, her body tense beside his. Mason nodded, drawing his pistol as they moved cautiously toward the door. Outside the yard lay empty, bathed in the fading gold of sunset. Their horses remained in their stalls, apparently overlooked in Blackwood's search. It was what lay by the water trough that stopped them cold. Redwood's body sprawled in the dirt, blood pooling beneath him from multiple gunshot wounds. His rifle lay beside him, unfired. They had given him no chance to defend himself. Mason knelt beside the fallen rancher, checking futilely for signs of life. Nothing. Redwood's eyes stared sightlessly at the darkening sky, his expression one of defiance even in death. "He bought us time," Mason said, voice thick with anger and grief. "Lied to them, kept them searching until dark." Tyann knelt beside Mason, touching Redwood's silver-streaked hair with gentle fingers. "His spirit runs to join Kalina," she said softly. "Eagle Clan welcomes brave hearts, even those not born to the tribe." Mason closed Redwood's eyes, wishing they had time for proper burial. But darkness was falling, and Blackwood might return at any moment. "We need to go," he said reluctantly. "Honor him by completing what he helped start." They saddled their horses quickly, keeping movements quiet despite their haste. Mason found Redwood's map in his pocket, studying it by the last light of day. The trail north would take them through difficult country, but if Blackwood believed they had fled east toward Silver Rock, it might give them the advantage they desperately needed. As they prepared to leave, Tyann paused, returning to Redwood's body. She knelt, murmuring words in Apache that Mason couldn't understand. From her pouch, she extracted her father's eagle feather, a sacred item she had carried since childhood, and placed it in Redwood's cold hand. "May you ride with eagle's wings," she whispered, rising. "May your spirit see all that follows." The gesture moved Mason deeply. Tyann had given one of her most precious possessions to honor a man who had sacrificed everything to help them. In that moment, he saw yet another facet of her strength, not just her resilience or courage, but her capacity for reverence, for honoring connections that transcended the boundaries others imposed. They mounted in the gathering darkness, taking one last look at the ranch that had briefly sheltered them. In death, James Redwood had given them not just a hiding place, but new evidence, a new route, and precious hours of safety. Mason silently vowed that the sacrifice would not be in vain. "North," he said, turning his horse toward the shadowy hills. "We ride through the night." Tyann nodded, her face set with renewed determination. For Redwood, for all of them. As they rode into the deepening darkness, Mason felt a change within himself, a crystallizing of purpose that went beyond survival, beyond even justice. This mission had become something sacred, a debt to be paid not just to Tyann or to the child he had once saved, but to all those who had fallen to Blackwood's cruelty and corruption. Tomorrow, they would reach Silver Rock. Tomorrow, they would confront Judge Hamilton with their evidence. And tomorrow, one way or another, Blackwood's long reign of terror would face its reckoning. The high country trail proved as treacherous as Redwood had warned. Narrow paths wound through dense pine forests, rocky inclines, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses through the most precarious sections. They rode through most of the night, pushing forward by moonlight, stopping only when the terrain became too dangerous to navigate in darkness. The silver eagle pendant hung around Tyann's neck, catching occasional glints of moonlight. She touched it often, as if drawing strength from the connection to both Redwood and his wife Kalina. Mason watched her from the corner of his eye, noting how the gesture seemed to steel her resolve at particularly difficult passages. "How much farther?" she asked, as they paused to rest the horses at a small clearing. Mason consulted Redwood's map by moonlight. "If we maintain this pace, we should reach Silver Rock by tomorrow evening." Tyen nodded, scanning the dark forest around them. "Blackwood will have men watching all approaches to the town." "Undoubtedly, but he'll be expecting us from the east or south." Mason traced their current route with his finger. "This trail brings us in through the old mining district. More cover, more people, easier to blend in." The night deepened around them. They continued in silence, each lost in private thoughts. Mason found himself replaying Redwood's final moments, not the death they had witnessed, but the life that had preceded it. A man who had loved across boundaries, who had waited 6 years for justice, who had given everything to help strangers because they shared his cause. "I should have done more," Mason said, suddenly breaking the long silence. "At the ranch, I should have fought alongside him." Tyen looked at him, her expression solemn in the moonlight. "Then you would be dead too, and Redwood's sacrifice would mean nothing. Still." The guilt weighed heavy, another name added to the ledger of those Mason had failed to save. "The living honor the dead not through guilt," Tyen said softly, "but through completing what they began." She touched the eagle pendant. "Each time we falter, we remember his courage. Each time we continue, we honor his spirit." The simple wisdom of her words penetrated Mason's self-recrimination. He nodded, accepting both the comfort and the challenge they contained. By dawn, they had made considerable progress through the mountains. From a high ridge, they caught their first glimpse of Silver Rock, a substantial town sprawled across a valley larger than Mason had expected. At its center stood the courthouse, its columned facade visible even at this distance. Their destination. Their purpose. "We'll rest here until dusk," Mason decided, guiding them to a sheltered hollow concealed by dense pine. "Enter town under cover of darkness." They dismounted, making a cold camp. Tyen sat with her back against a pine trunk, legs folded beneath her eyes, closed in what appeared to be meditation. Mason wondered if she was communing with the spirits her people believed in, or simply gathering her strength for what lay ahead. "What do you see for your people?" he asked suddenly. "If we succeed." Tyen opened her eyes, studying him. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. When she did, her voice carried a depth of longing that caught him off guard. "I see children learning our ways without fear, elders dying on the land of their birth, women gathering plants that have not been trampled by cattle, men hunting game that has not been driven away by miners." She paused. "I see a future where Apache does not mean enemy or savage, but simply people." "A worthy vision," Mason said. "And you, Mason Reed, what future do you see if Blackwood falls?" The question took him by surprise. For so long his existence had been defined by what he was running from, not what he might run toward. "I haven't thought beyond stopping him," he admitted. "For 15 years, that's been enough." "Perhaps it is time to want more," Tyen suggested. She rose, moving closer to the edge of their sheltered hollow. "The eagle does not live to kill the snake. It kills the snake to live." Mason considered her words as he took first watch, studying the town through his spyglass. Regular movement of men on horseback along the perimeter confirmed his suspicions, Blackwood's men watching for their approach. They were well prepared, but their attention focused on the main roads. The old mining trail remained their best chance. When Tyen woke around midday, Mason shared his observations. "They're patrolling all the main roads. Pairs of riders changing positions every 2 hours. Blackwood is thorough, she noted, accepting the jerky and hardtack he offered. Always was, even at Broken Ridge. Mason collapsed the spyglass, tucking it into his saddlebag. But we have something he doesn't expect. What? Knowledge of who we're looking for. Mason spread Redwood's map between them, pointing to the courthouse. Judge Hamilton holds court during the day, but according to Redwood's notes, he lives here, private residence on the north side of town. If we can reach him directly, bypass Blackwood's men entirely. Tyen considered this. You believe a federal judge will listen to us? An Apache woman and a man Blackwood has branded a murderer. Hamilton's reputation is for fairness, at least according to Redwood's notes. And these documents, Mason tapped the leather folder containing their combined evidence, speak for themselves. Unless Blackwood has reached him first. The possibility hung between them. Mason had considered it, of course. Blackwood's influence extended throughout the territory. What if Judge Hamilton was already compromised? What if this journey Redwood's sacrifice, all of it, was for nothing? We won't know until we try, he said finally. And we've come too far to turn back now. They spent the remaining daylight hours preparing. Mason cleaned his revolver and rifle, checking each round with methodical care. Tyen organized the documents, ensuring they could be quickly retrieved and presented. Both studied Redwood's map of Silver Rock, memorizing streets and landmarks, planning their approach. As dusk gathered, Tyen changed into the calico dress Mason had purchased in Cooper's Crossing. She tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, transforming her appearance from Apache woman to frontier settler. The disguise wouldn't withstand close scrutiny, but it might buy them precious moments of anonymity. She emerged from behind a stand of pines where she'd changed, and Mason was struck by how the transformation altered her. Not her essential nature, the strength and dignity remained, but how differently the world would perceive her in these clothes. The thought angered him that such superficial changes could determine whether a person was seen as human or other. You look uncomfortable, he observed. These clothes bind movement, she replied, adjusting the unfamiliar bodice. And spirit. I feel less myself. And you could never be less yourself, Mason said with sudden conviction, no matter what clothes they put on you. Tyen looked at him, surprise flickering across her features, followed by something warmer. You see clearly, Mason Reed. Ready? He asked, as the first stars appeared overhead. Tyen nodded, touching the eagle pendant one last time. For Redwood. For Redwood, he echoed. From the shadows of an abandoned mine shaft, they watched Silver Rock come alive with evening activity. Saloons blazed with light and raucous laughter. Miners fresh from their claims swaggered down boardwalks. Ladies of questionable reputation called from balconies. And through it all moved Blackwood's deputies, watchful and methodical. 4 at the south entrance, Mason murmured, 2 on each main street, 1 stationed outside the hotel. And there, Tyen pointed toward the courthouse square, 2 more. Mason nodded. He's not taking any chances. They waited for full darkness before making their move. Leaving their horses hidden in the abandoned mine building, they descended into town on foot, keeping to alleys and service ways between buildings. Twice they froze, as deputies passed within feet of their hiding place, conversations about card games and women floating in their wake. According to Redwood's map, Judge Hamilton's residence stood on a quiet street 3 blocks north of the courthouse, a substantial 2-story house set back from the road surrounded by a wrought iron fence. As they approached, Mason noted a light burning in a ground-floor window, but no sign of guards or watchers. Too easy, he muttered, studying the house from the shadow of an alley across the street. Perhaps Hamilton does not know he is part of Blackwood's hunt, Tyen suggested. Perhaps? Mason wasn't convinced. Nothing had been easy thus far. Why would their final approach to Hamilton be different? They crossed the street quickly, keeping their heads down as a group of townspeople passed nearby. The iron gate opened with a faint creak that set Mason's nerves on edge. They hurried up the walkway to the front door, every sense alert for danger. Mason knocked softly, then more firmly when no response came. After a long moment, they heard footsteps approaching from inside. The door opened a crack, revealing an elderly man with spectacles perched on his nose. "Yes?" he asked, peering at them suspiciously. "Judge Hamilton," Mason kept his voice low. "Who's asking?" "My name is Mason Reed. This is Tyen. We need to speak with you on a matter of utmost importance. It concerns Sheriff Blackwood and certain land transactions in Apache territory." The man's expression changed immediately, alarm replacing suspicion. "Get inside quickly," he hissed, opening the door wider. They entered a well-appointed foyer, Hamilton closing and locking the door behind them. He led them through to a study lined with bookshelves, a fire burning low in the hearth. "You've taken an extraordinary risk coming here," Hamilton said, turning to face them. He was older than Mason had expected, perhaps in his late 60s, with thinning white hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Despite his age, he stood straight with the bearing of a man accustomed to authority. "Blackwood has half the town looking for you." "Then you know who we are," Mason said, hand moving instinctively toward his concealed revolver. "I know what Blackwood claims you are," Hamilton corrected. "Murderers, thieves, dangerous fugitives who must be apprehended at any cost." He studied them with shrewd eyes. "Yet here you stand in my study, appearing neither murderous nor particularly dangerous." "Appearances can deceive," Tyen said quietly. Hamilton's gaze shifted to her, taking in the calico dress, the carefully arranged hair. "Indeed, they can, Miss Tyen." His expression softened slightly. "Just as a federal judge may not be what Sheriff Blackwood believes him to be." He gestured toward chairs arranged before the fireplace. "Please sit. Tell me why you've risked so much to find me." They sat, Mason positioning himself with clear sightlines to both door and window. Tyen reached into her dress, extracting the leather folder containing their evidence. She placed it on the small table between them, but did not immediately offer it to Hamilton. "These documents prove what many have long suspected," she said, "that Blackwood and others have systematically stolen Apache lands through fraud, corruption, and violence." "Serious allegations," Hamilton observed. "What makes you believe I would act on such evidence?" "James Redwood trusted you," Mason replied. "He died ensuring these papers reached your hands." "Redwood," Hamilton repeated, a flicker of genuine sorrow crossing his features. "I'd heard rumors of his death. How did it happen?" "Blackwood shot him in cold blood," Mason said flatly. "No warning, no chance to defend himself. All because he helped us." Hamilton was silent for a moment, absorbing this. "James Redwood was a good man," he said finally, "one of the few who treated the local Apache with genuine respect and fairness." He looked at Tyen. "His wife was Apache, I believe." "Sierra Band," Tyen confirmed. "Killed in one of Blackwood's raids 6 years ago." Hamilton nodded slowly. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the folder. Tyen hesitated, then slid it across to him. "Redwood believed you would know what to do with these, that you could be trusted when others could not." "A heavy responsibility," Hamilton murmured, opening the folder. As the judge examined the documents, Mason watched him closely, alert for any sign of deception or alarm. Hamilton's expression remained neutral, only the occasional tightening of his lips or narrowing of his eyes betraying reaction to particularly damning evidence. "These are extensive," he said, finally looking up. And damning. Land transfers, falsified reports, military orders, names and dates spanning 15 years. He closed the folder slowly. Do you understand what you're asking of me? These documents implicate not just Blackwood, but territorial officials, military commanders, business leaders. Men with power, Mason acknowledged. Men who won't welcome exposure. Men who would kill to prevent it, Hamilton corrected bluntly, as they apparently killed Redwood. We understand the risk, Tyen said. We have lived with it for many days. The question is whether you are willing to share it. Hamilton rose, moving to pour himself a small measure of brandy from a decanter on his desk. He did not offer them any a slight that Mason noted but did not comment on. The territorial governor arrives tomorrow morning, he said after taking a sip. Here for our monthly court session. Governor Wallace is an honorable man, but practical. These documents, he tapped the folder, require both honor and practicality to address properly. What are you suggesting? Mason asked. Hamilton turned to face them fully. That you allow me to present these documents to Wallace privately before any public proceedings. That together we formulate a strategy that brings justice without provoking immediate backlash from those implicated. More delays, Tyen said, frustration edging her voice, while Blackwood remains free to hurt others. Not delays, Miss Tyen. Preparation. Hamilton's tone grew firmer. You've carried these documents far and at great cost. Would you risk their impact now by moving too hastily? Mason and Tyen exchanged glances. The judge's argument made sense, yet something felt wrong. After their desperate journey, this measured legal approach seemed almost anticlimactic. How do we know you won't simply hand these over to Blackwood? Mason asked directly. Hamilton's expression hardened. Because contrary to what you may believe, Mr. Reed, not all white officials in this territory are corrupt. Some of us still remember the oaths we took. He returned to his chair, brandy in hand. Blackwood has been a growing cancer in Silver Rock for years. Many have suspected his dealings, but proof has been elusive. You've brought what we've needed. And Redwood trusted you, Tyen added softly. Yes, Hamilton acknowledged, though I failed him once before. At their questioning looks, he explained, when his wife was killed, Redwood came to me seeking justice. I could do nothing without evidence. Perhaps if I had pushed harder then, he shook his head. Another regret, in a life that has accumulated too many. The admission shifted something in Mason's assessment of the judge. Hamilton wasn't just a legal functionary. He was a man with his own history, his own burdens, perhaps even his own debts to repay. One night, Mason decided, we'll give you until morning court session to speak with the governor. After that, we present the evidence ourselves, whatever the consequences. Hamilton nodded, accepting the terms. You'll need a safe place to stay. Not a hotel. Blackwood has men watching them all. He considered for a moment. My housekeeper's quarters above the carriage house. Simple but private. No one will think to look for you there. And our documents? Tyen asked, her hand extending protectively toward the folder. I have a safe here, Hamilton said, gesturing toward his desk. Secure until morning. Only I know the combination. Mason wanted to object, to insist they keep the precious evidence with them, but logic prevailed. If Blackwood's men somehow discovered their location, better the documents be locked away than lost entirely. Hamilton led them through the back garden to a small structure behind the main house. The upper floor contained a modest room with a single bed table and chair, sparse but clean. Rest, he advised. Tomorrow will require clear heads and steady nerves. My housekeeper is away visiting her sister, so you'll have complete privacy. I'll come for you before court convenes at 9. After he departed, Mason checked the small quarters thoroughly. Window latches, possible escape routes, sight lines to the main house and street beyond. The windows overlooked Hamilton's garden, offering a clear view of anyone approaching from the main house. "What do you think?" he asked Tyen, who stood watching his methodical inspection. "I think we have little choice but to trust him," she replied, "at least until morning." "And the documents," she touched the eagle pendant at her throat. "We have traveled far on faith, Mason Reed. Perhaps a little more will carry us to our destination." The simple wisdom of her perspective settled Mason's concerns, at least temporarily. They had indeed come too far to falter now over suspicion alone. The room contained only the single bed, narrow but adequate. Mason hesitated, glancing at the small chair in the corner. "Don't be foolish," Tyen said, reading his thoughts. "We have shared closer quarters on this journey." Without further discussion, they settled onto the bed, backs to each other, a careful space maintained between them despite the limited width. Mason extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, broken only by moonlight filtering through lace curtains. Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded Mason. Too many questions circled his mind. Could they trust Hamilton? Would the territorial governor be receptive to their evidence? And what of Blackwood? Would he somehow sense the net closing around him? Beside him, Tyen's breathing gradually slowed, though Mason suspected she wasn't truly sleeping either. The tension in her body, the occasional shift of her weight, betrayed the same watchful readiness that had kept them both alive this far. "Mason," she said softly, confirming his suspicion. "Are you awake?" "Yes?" She turned toward him, her face pale in the moonlight. "If tomorrow succeeds, if Blackwood faces justice, what then?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. For 15 years, Mason had been defined by what he was running from. Now, with the end potentially in sight, the future loomed unexplored and uncertain. "I don't know," he admitted. "For so long, stopping Blackwood has been the only future I could imagine. As it has been for me." Tyen's voice carried a vulnerability he rarely heard. "Sometimes I wonder if I would recognize a life without this burden." Mason turned to face her, struck by how the moonlight softened her features, revealing the young woman beneath the hardened exterior. "What would you want if you could choose any future?" She considered this as if the question were entirely new. "Land where my people could live in peace. A place to teach our children our ways without fear." Her gaze met his. "And you, what would Mason Reed choose?" The question stirred something deep within him. For 15 years, his existence had been defined by what he was running from, not what he might run toward. Yet now, looking at Tyen in the soft darkness, he glimpsed possibilities he hadn't dared contemplate. "A purpose," he said finally. "Something to build rather than destroy. And," he hesitated, "not to be alone anymore." Tyen's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers twining with his. The gesture was simple yet profound, an acknowledgement of the unspoken connection that had grown between them through danger and shared purpose. "We should try to sleep," she whispered. Mason nodded, though neither moved to break the contact between their hands. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them both, sleep arriving, as their breathing synchronized in the quiet room. Mason dreamed of eagles soaring over open plains of a cabin by a river, where smoke rose peacefully from the chimney. Of Tyen standing in the doorway, smiling as he returned from hunting. The dream was so vivid he could smell pine smoke, hear water rushing over stones. He woke suddenly, the dream images dissolving into darkness. Something had changed. The house was too quiet, the air too still. Beside him, Tyen had also woken, her body tense with alertness. "What is it?" he whispered. "Listen." she breathed. Mason strained his ears. At first he heard nothing, then faintly voices from the main house, Hamilton's distinctive tone raised in what sounded like alarm or protest. Another voice responded lower, threatening. They rose in unison, reaching for weapons. Mason checked the window, still clear, no sign of watchers in the garden below. The eastern sky showed the first hints of approaching dawn. "Hamilton said his housekeeper comes at dawn," Mason murmured, moving to the door. "Would a housekeeper move so carefully?" Tyen countered, buckling on her knife belt beneath the calico dress. Mason cracked the door, listening. The voices had stopped, replaced by heavy footsteps moving through the main house. "Blackwood?" Tyen asked. "Possibly." Mason checked his revolver. "We need to go, now." Tyen moved like a shadow down the servants' staircase, each step silent, despite the unfamiliar dress. Mason followed carefully, placing his weight to avoid creaking boards. At the bottom, a small door opened onto Hamilton's garden, still dark in the pre-dawn gloom. They slipped outside, using ornamental shrubs for cover as they made their way toward the rear gate. The garden was immaculate, geometrically arranged flower beds, gravel paths, a small fountain now silent for the night. At its center stood a stone bench beneath an arbor draped with climbing roses. In daylight, it would be beautiful. Now it offered only shadows to hide their escape. They had nearly reached the gate when the sound of Hamilton's front door being forcefully opened echoed through the quiet morning. Voices raised in angry demand carried clearly Blackwood had arrived. "This way," Mason whispered, leading Tyen into the alley that ran behind the row of houses. Unlike the well-tended front streets, Silver Rock's back alleys revealed the town's rougher nature, piles of discarded crates, broken bottles, the occasional sleeping drunk. They moved swiftly, avoiding the few early risers beginning their day. Kitchen maids lighting stoves, stable boys fetching water, a stray dog sniffing through yesterday's refuse. Mason checked his pocket watch in the growing light, 6:30, nearly 2 hours until the court session. The question that burned in both their minds remained unspoken. Had Hamilton betrayed them, or was he buying them time? "We need somewhere to wait," Mason muttered, scanning the surrounding buildings. "There," Tyen pointed to a church at the end of the street, its doors already open for morning prayers. "They will not look for us in a house of the white man's God." The irony wasn't lost on Mason, but the logic was sound. They entered the church, finding it empty, save for an elderly priest arranging hymnals in the front pews. He looked up as they approached, offering a gentle smile. "Welcome, my children. You're early for morning service." "Father," Mason began, thinking quickly, "my wife and I are travelers just passing through. Might we rest here a while?" The priest studied them, his gaze lingering on Tyen's face, partially concealed beneath a shawl she had pulled forward. If he recognized her as Apache, he gave no sign. "Of course," he said kindly. "God's house is open to all weary souls. Please, make yourselves comfortable." He gestured to a pew near the back. "I have duties to attend to, but call if you need anything." He shuffled away, leaving them alone in the quiet sanctuary. Mason chose a seat that offered a clear view of both the main entrance and a side door. Tyen sat beside him, her body tense despite the peaceful surroundings. "Do you believe Hamilton will protect the documents?" she asked softly. "I don't know," Mason admitted. "But he had no reason to warn us of Blackwood's arrival if he meant to betray us. Unless it was to separate us from the evidence." The possibility hadn't escaped Mason. They had entrusted their precious cargo to a man they barely knew on the strength of Redwood's recommendation and Hamilton's own claim of ancestral connection to Eagle Clan. "We'll know soon enough," he said, checking his watch again. 1 hour until court convenes." As the church gradually filled with worshippers, Mason observed each new arrival with wary attention. Most seemed to be ordinary townspeople, shopkeepers, miners, ranchers with their families, but any could be Blackwood's informants. The sheriff's reach in Silver Rock was extensive. From his seat, Mason had a limited view of the street through the church's open door. People passed by, their pace quickening as the workday approached. Among them, he noticed several of Blackwood's deputies moving with purpose rather than making their usual patrol rounds. Something had changed. At 7:45, Mason nodded to Tyan. They slipped out during a hymn unnoticed amid the raised voices of the congregation. The courthouse stood 2 blocks away, its imposing facade now bathed in morning sunlight. Deputies flanked the main entrance, checking anyone who entered. Mason extracted the paper Hamilton had given them, an official-looking document bearing the territorial seal and Hamilton's signature. A judicial summons requiring the bearers to appear as witnesses in the morning session. "Clever," Mason murmured. "Blackwood's men won't question an official summons." Sure enough, the deputies at the courthouse doors examined the document and waved them through without comment. Inside the building hummed with activity clerks, hurrying with armloads of papers, lawyers conferring in hushed tones, citizens waiting on hard wooden benches. The main courtroom doors stood open. Mason and Tyan entered, finding the large chamber already half filled with spectators. Hamilton sat at the judge's bench, arranging papers with deliberate calm. To his right, at a small table, sat an elegantly dressed man Mason didn't recognize, perhaps the territorial governor Hamilton had mentioned. "There," Tyan whispered, nodding toward a figure seated near the front. "Our documents." Mason followed her gaze to a nervous-looking young man clutching a familiar leather folder. Hamilton's clerk, presumably safeguarding their evidence until the session began. They found seats near the back positions that offered clear views of both the main doors and the judge's bench. As 9 o'clock approached, the courtroom filled to capacity, an unusual crowd for a routine morning session. Word had spread, it seemed, that today's proceedings might prove extraordinary. At precisely 9, a bailiff called the court to order. Hamilton rose, his black robes flowing as he took his place at the bench. Mason studied him intently, searching for signs of distress or coercion. The judge appeared composed, but there was a tension around his eyes, a tightness to his mouth that suggested inner turmoil. "All rise," called the bailiff. "The Territorial Court of Silver Rock is now in session, the Honorable Judge Ezekiel Hamilton presiding." The crowd stood, then settled back into their seats as Hamilton gestured for them to be seated. He arranged papers before him, adjusted his spectacles, then looked out at the assembled citizens. "Before we proceed with the regular docket," he announced, voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "I wish to address a matter of significant public interest." He gestured to the well-dressed man beside him. "Governor Wallace has graciously agreed to join us this morning to hear evidence regarding certain land transactions and administrative practices within our territory." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mason tensed, eyes shifting to the main doors. Where was Blackwood? Surely he would have been alerted to this unusual session. As if summoned by the thought, the courtroom doors swung open with deliberate force. All heads turned as Victor Blackwood strode in, flanked by 4 deputies. His black coat seemed to absorb the morning light, his face set in the same cold expression Mason remembered from Broken Ridge. He moved to the front of the courtroom with the confidence of a man accustomed to deference. "Your Honor," he drawled loud enough for all to hear, "I was just informed of this special session. May I ask what evidence you intend to present?" Hamilton met his gaze steadily. "Documents have come into my possession, Sheriff Blackwood suggesting improprieties in land acquisitions throughout the territory. Given your position as Chief Law Enforcement Officer in this district, I felt it appropriate you should be present for their review." Blackwood's smile never reached his eyes. "How considerate, Your Honor. And might I inquire as to the source of these documents?" "You may not," Hamilton replied firmly. "Not at this juncture." Mason exchanged glances with Tyen. Hamilton was playing a dangerous game, deliberately provoking Blackwood while keeping their presence concealed. For now, they remained anonymous spectators unnoticed at the back of the crowded room. Hamilton gestured to his clerk. "Mr. Phillips, the documents, please." The nervous young man rose, approaching the bench with the leather folder. As he handed it to Hamilton, Blackwood's gaze followed it with sudden intensity. Recognition flashed across his features, quickly masked. "Your Honor," Blackwood interrupted again, voice hardening. "Before proceeding further, I must inform you that 2 dangerous fugitives were seen entering this courthouse. My men are searching the building." Hamilton looked up sharply. "This is my courtroom, Sheriff. No searches will be conducted without my authorization." "With respect," Blackwood countered, producing papers from his coat. "I have warrants for their arrest. Mason Reed and an Apache woman known as Tyen, wanted for the murders of James Redwood and 3 settlers in the Northern Territory." The crowd stirred, people turning to look at their neighbors with sudden suspicion. Mason tensed hand and moving toward his concealed revolver. Tyen touched his arm, a silent warning against premature action. "These are serious allegations, Sheriff," Hamilton said. "However, they have no bearing on the documents before me. Please take a seat while we proceed." Blackwood remained standing, his posture shifting subtly from deferential to challenging. "Those documents were stolen from official territorial records, Your Honor. They are themselves evidence of criminal activity. That remains to be determined." Hamilton opened the folder, beginning to examine its contents with Governor Wallace. "Governor, if you would join me." The governor rose, moving to stand beside Hamilton. Together, they bent over the documents, speaking in low tones that didn't carry to the spectators. Blackwood watched with growing tension, his hand resting ostentatiously on his holstered revolver. The courtroom waited in hushed anticipation. Mason studied the crowd, identifying Blackwood's deputies positioned strategically throughout the room. If violence erupted, innocent bystanders would be caught in the crossfire. The realization increased his determination to avoid drawing his weapon, if at all possible. After several minutes, Hamilton and the governor straightened. The governor's face had gone pale, his expression grave. He whispered something to Hamilton, who nodded before addressing the court once more. "Having reviewed these documents with Governor Wallace," Hamilton announced formally, "I find sufficient evidence to warrant immediate investigation into multiple allegations of fraud, corruption, and abuse of authority." He turned to Blackwood. "Sheriff Blackwood, in light of your apparent involvement in several of the incidents documented here, I am temporarily relieving you of duty pending full inquiry." A collective gasp rose from the spectators. Blackwood's deputies exchanged uncertain glances, hands moving toward their weapons. "This is absurd," Blackwood snarled, all pretense of respect abandoned. "Those documents are forgeries created by the very fugitives hiding in this courtroom." "The documents bear official territorial seals," Hamilton countered, "including signatures from military commanders, land office officials, and," he paused significantly, "your own sheriff, on orders authorizing removal of Apache settlements from lands subsequently sold to mining interests." Blackwood's face darkened. "You're making a grave mistake, Hamilton. These charges won't stand." "Perhaps not," the judge acknowledged. "But they warrant investigation at the very least. Bailiff, please take Sheriff Blackwood into custody." The bailiff moved forward hesitantly, Clearly intimidated by Blackwood and his armed deputies, tension crackled through the courtroom as he approached. "This is your last warning, Hamilton," Blackwood said softly. "Drop this now, or face the consequences." The judge held his gaze. "In 15 years on the bench, Sheriff, I have faced many consequences for upholding the law. None have deterred me yet." The standoff stretched the entire courtroom, holding its breath. Then, with deliberate slowness, Blackwood unbuckled his gun belt, handing it to the bailiff. "Very well," he said, voice dangerously calm. "We'll do this your way for now." For a collective exhale swept through the spectators. The bailiff, looking relieved, motioned for Blackwood to follow him to the side door that connected to the courthouse jail. As they reached the doorway, Blackwood suddenly paused. His gaze swept the courtroom once more, methodically searching the faces of those present. Mason felt Tyen tense beside him, felt his own muscles coil in readiness. Blackwood's eyes continued their slow survey until inevitably they found them in the back row. Recognition and hatred flashed across his face with such intensity that Mason could feel it like a physical force. "You," he hissed, loud enough to carry through the silent room. "You think this is over?" Before anyone could react, Blackwood moved with startling speed. He grabbed the bailiff's pistol from its holster, shoving the man aside with brutal efficiency. The weapon came up aimed not at Hamilton or the governor, but directly at Mason and Tyen. 15 years, Blackwood snarled. 15 years building what you've destroyed today. If I burn you, burn with me. The shot cracked through the courtroom like thunder. Mason lunged sideways, knocking Tyen to the floor as the bullet splintered the bench where she had been sitting. Screams erupted, spectators diving for cover or rushing toward the exits in panic. Blackwood's deputies, stunned by the sudden violence, hesitated a crucial moment before drawing their own weapons. In that moment of confusion, Blackwood fired again, the shot going wild as Governor Wallace tackled him from behind. They went down in a tangle of limbs, the governor showing unexpected strength as he grappled with Blackwood for the pistol. A third shot roared deafening in the enclosed space. The governor cried out, rolling away, clutching his shoulder. Blackwood rose, pistol trained once more on Mason and Tyen, who had taken cover behind an overturned bench. His face contorted with a hatred that transcended reason or self-preservation. "You took everything from me," he shouted. "Everything? Get down!" Mason hissed to Tyen, pushing her further behind the bench. He drew his revolver, calculating angles, aware that any shot risked hitting innocent bystanders still scrambling for cover. "You took everything from yourself, Blackwood," he called back. "Every village you burned, every life you destroyed, it all led here." Blackwood's laugh was hollow, edged with madness, still playing the hero reed. "You couldn't save that Apache brat at Broken Ridge. You won't save this one either." "That brat survived," Tyen replied, rising to stand despite Mason's protective gesture. She touched the eagle pendant at her throat, her voice carrying clearly through the now quieting courtroom. "I am that child from Broken Ridge. I survived. I remembered. And now I have brought justice." The words seemed to strike Blackwood like physical blows. His expression shifted disbelief, warring with growing recognition as he studied her features. "Impossible," he whispered. "That girl died in the ravine. I made certain of it." "The eagle sees what others miss," Tyen said. "The eagle remembers what others forget." Blackwood's pistol wavered slightly, the first sign of uncertainty he had shown. "You're lying," he snarled, but the conviction had drained from his voice. In that moment of hesitation, Mason might have fired, might have ended Blackwood's threat permanently. Instead, he held his position, sensing a greater reckoning unfolding. You left us to die, Tyen continued, her voice taking on a hypnotic quality that held the entire courtroom spellbound. But the ravine protected us. Apache medicine men found us. Mason nearly died from your bullet, but they saved him. And I remembered. Every face at Broken Ridge, every shot fired, every lie in your reports. Blackwood's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. For the first time, fear entered his eyes. Not fear of physical harm, but something deeper. The fear of a man whose carefully constructed reality was crumbling. "Enough!" he roared, steadying his aim once more. "It doesn't matter who you are. You'll both die here today." His finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire a shot, rang out from the side of the courtroom. Blackwood staggered, dropping to one knee, blood blossoming on his black coat where the bullet had struck his shoulder. He looked up in shock and fury. Judge Hamilton stood beside his bench, a small derringer smoking in his hand. "That's enough, Victor," he said quietly. "It's over." Blackwood snarled, raising his pistol toward the judge. Mason fired in the same instant, his bullet striking Blackwood's hand. The sheriff's weapon clattered to the floor, and he collapsed, clutching his bleeding hand to his chest. "You should have killed me, Reed." Blackwood gasped, blood seeping between his fingers. "Because I'll never stop, not while you draw breath. Then you'll spend the rest of your days in a territorial prison cell," Hamilton replied, handing his derringer to a deputy who had finally recovered enough to approach. "With plenty of time to consider your failures." Deputies moved to restrain Blackwood, who sat in stunned silence staring at Tyen with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. The man who had loomed so large in their lives for 15 years suddenly seemed diminished, his power broken by truth and justice rather than violence. "This court is in recess," Hamilton announced to the stunned spectators. "Please exit in an orderly fashion. Deputies, secure the prisoner and summon the doctor for Governor Wallace." As the crowd began to disperse, Hamilton approached Mason and Tyen, his face grave but determined. "I believe," he said quietly, "we have much to discuss. My chambers, if you please." Hamilton's private office was exactly as Mason had imagined. Leather-bound books lining the walls, a massive oak desk windows overlooking the town square. The leather folder containing their evidence lay open on the desk, documents spread across its surface. "Sit, please," Hamilton said, gesturing to chairs opposite the desk. He remained standing, moving to a cabinet from which he extracted a bottle of whiskey and 3 glasses. Without asking, he poured generous measures, sliding 2 across the desk toward them. "A near thing," he said, raising his glass slightly. "Closer than I care to admit." Mason took his glass, but didn't drink. "What happened this morning? At your house?" Hamilton sighed, sinking into his chair. "Blackwood arrived shortly after midnight. Claimed to have information that I was harboring fugitives. Demanded to search the premises. Did he know about the documents? He suspected, I think. Kept asking if you had given me anything, shown me any papers." Hamilton took a long swallow of whiskey. "I denied everything, of course. Said I hadn't seen you, knew nothing of any documents." "He believed you?" Tyen asked skeptically. "Not entirely, but I convinced him I would alert him immediately if you appeared." Hamilton gestured toward the folder. "Meanwhile, I had already sent these to my clerk with instructions to bring them directly to the courthouse this morning. I hoped Blackwood would focus on finding you rather than the evidence itself." "A dangerous gamble," Mason observed. "All justice is Mr. Reed." Hamilton's gaze was steady, particularly in territories where law is still flexible. Governor Wallace entered his wounded shoulder, now bandaged, his expression grim. "Hamilton," he said without preamble, "we have a situation developing. Blackwood's men in town are gathering. Word of his arrest is spreading. Loyal to the end, Hamilton murmured. Or perhaps just worried about what he might reveal. What happens now? Mason asked. The governor studied them both, his assessment frank and unsparing. That depends largely on you two. The documents you've brought implicate dozens of officials, business leaders, military officers. Some dead, some still very much alive and powerful. Justice requires full disclosure, Tyen said firmly. Justice, the governor repeated as if tasting the word. A noble concept, but often messy in practice. Full disclosure, as you put it, could destabilize the entire territorial administration, create a vacuum that might be filled by forces no better than those currently in power. You're suggesting compromise, Mason said, recognizing the political calculation taking shape. I'm suggesting prudence, Wallace corrected. Targeted prosecution of the worst offenders. Reparations for the most grievously harmed Apache bands. Reform of land claim procedures. But not a wholesale purge that would leave the territory ungovernable. Tyen's expression hardened. Half justice is no justice. Half justice today, Hamilton interjected, with the possibility of more tomorrow. These documents don't disappear. They become leverage, a sword hanging over those who might otherwise continue Blackwood's methods. Mason stood moving to the window. Outside, life in Silver Rock continued, people going about their business, unaware of the momentous choices being made within these walls. How many of them, he wondered, had benefited from Blackwood's corruption? How many had turned blind eyes to injustice because it served their interests? And if we refuse this compromise, he asked without turning, if we demand full disclosure, complete justice. Hamilton and Wallace exchanged glances. It was the governor who answered, his tone blunt. Then I cannot guarantee your safety, or that these documents will ever see the light of day. He gestured to his bandaged shoulder. Already certain elements are suggesting this was all an elaborate plot by Apache sympathizers to assassinate territorial officials. Blackwood is being portrayed by some as a hero who intervened. That's absurd, Mason protested. There were hundreds of witnesses. Witnesses see what they expect to see, Wallace said simply, or what powerful interests encourage them to see. History is written by those who control the narrative, Mr. Reed. The question before us is whether you wish to influence that narrative or become its victims. The brutal pragmatism of frontier justice, Mason thought. Not the clean resolution of storybooks, but the messy, compromised reality of a world where power didn't yield easily to ideals. He turned back to Tyen, whose face reflected the same bitter calculations. This should be your decision, he said quietly. These are your people's lands, your father's records, your justice to seek. Tyen touched the eagle pendant at her throat, fingers tracing its silver contours. For a long moment, she was silent, gaze distant, as if consulting voices only she could hear. My grandmother once told me, she said finally, that eagles do not fight battles they cannot win. They soar above, watching, waiting for the moment when victory is possible. She looked up, meeting Mason's gaze. Perhaps this is not our final battle, but merely the first. The wisdom in her words struck Mason deeply. They had accomplished what had seemed impossible, reaching Silver Rock, presenting the evidence, bringing Blackwood to a reckoning. Perhaps demanding complete victory now would squander what they had already achieved. We'll accept your negotiated settlement, Mason told Wallace and Hamilton, with conditions. The Apache bands receive not just reparations, but guaranteed land rights documented and protected by federal authority. The commission reviewing land claims includes Apache representatives, and, he glanced at Tyen, who nodded confirmation, we retain copies of all documents, insurance against future betrayals. Wallace considered the terms, then nodded slowly. I believe I can agree to those conditions, particularly given the delicate nature of my current position. Then we have an accord, Mason said, extending his hand. Wallace rose, accepting the handshake with solemn formality. History may not record your names, he said, but I give you my word that what you've accomplished today will not be forgotten. History has forgotten many things, Tyen observed, but the eagle remembers. The negotiations took 3 days in tense, exhausting sessions with Governor Wallace and various territorial officials hastily summoned to Silver Rock. Throughout, Mason and Tyen remained officially anonymous, referred to in documents only as material witnesses, to preserve their safety from Blackwood's remaining allies. The discussions were far from simple. Each point contested, each concession reluctantly granted. Territorial officials argued that total review of past land transactions would create economic chaos. Military representatives insisted certain operations had been necessary for security. Mining interests claimed ignorance of any illegality in their acquisitions. Through it all, Hamilton proved surprisingly tenacious. My career is effectively over after this, he confided to Mason during a brief recess. Might as well make it count. The judge leveraged every ounce of his legal knowledge and moral authority, backed by the implicit threat of the document's public release. Governor Wallace, his arm still in a sling, provided the political weight needed to overcome the most entrenched opposition. Tyen participated fully in the negotiations, her quiet dignity and articulate presentation forcing officials to acknowledge her not as an Apache supplicant, but as an equal participant in territorial governance. More than once, Mason watched territorial officials squirm as she calmly recounted atrocities they had approved with the stroke of a pen. By the third day, an agreement had been reached, one that, while imperfect, represented more justice than either Mason or Tyen had dared hope for. 4 of Blackwood's deputies would face prosecution for their roles in the Broken Ridge Massacre and subsequent raids. A territorial commission, including 3 Apache representatives, would review all land transactions involving tribal territory over the past 20 years, with authority to invalidate those found fraudulent. Most significantly, 3 Apache bands, including Tyen's, would receive permanent title to lands previously taken from them, protected by federal decree. Blackwood himself would stand trial, though, for lesser charges than his full crimes warranted, a concession Mason found particularly bitter. Yet, as Hamilton pointed out, even a partial conviction would ensure the former sheriff spent his remaining years in prison, his power and influence permanently broken. It's done, Hamilton announced, signing the final document with a flourish. The governor will present these agreements to the Territorial Assembly next week. Barring unforeseen circumstances, they should be ratified by month's end. And if unforeseen circumstances arise, Mason asked. Hamilton smiled thinly. Then certain documents currently secured in my personal safe might find their way to newspapers in Washington and New York. Insurance, as you put it. They left the courthouse through the main entrance, this time no longer fugitives, needing shadows and back alleys. The afternoon sun warmed their faces as they stepped onto Silver Rock's busy main street. Mason realized he was seeing the town with new eyes. No longer a threatening maze of potential ambushes, but simply a frontier settlement, dusty rough around the edges, but alive with possibility. People passed them without a second glance, unaware that the town they knew had been fundamentally changed by the events of the past 3 days. I want to visit Redwood's grave before we leave, Tyen said as they walked. He deserves to know what his sacrifice achieved. Mason nodded. I'd like that too. They had learned from Hamilton that Redwood had been buried in Silver Rock's small cemetery, the judge himself arranging for a proper burial rather than the pauper's grave, usually reserved for those without family. The simple marker bore only Redwood's name and the words, "He sought justice." Tyen knelt beside the fresh earth, removing the silver eagle pendant from around her neck. She placed it carefully at the base of the headstone. "Kalina's work returns to him," she explained, seeing Mason's surprised expression. "The circle completes." "Won't you miss it?" he asked. She touched her wrist where the eagle mark was visible beneath her sleeve. "I carry the sign within me." He needed it more to find his way to her in the spirit lands. They stood in silence for a moment, paying their respects to the man who had given everything to help strangers because he believed in justice. The simple grave beneath the cottonwood trees seemed inadequate recognition for such sacrifice, yet somehow fitting for a man who had lived without pretension. "What now?" Mason asked as they left the cemetery, walking toward the livery where their horses had been stabled. Tyen considered the question, her expression thoughtful. "My people should hear of this agreement directly from me. They have lived too long with broken promises delivered by strangers." Mason nodded, unsurprised by her answer, yet feeling a hollow opening within him at the implied separation. "I understand," he said carefully. "They need their messenger." Tyen stopped, turning to face him fully. "And what of you, Mason Reed? Where will you go?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. For 15 years, Mason's life had been defined by what he was running from. Now, with Blackwood defeated and the burden of Broken Ridge finally lifted, the future stretched before him, unmarked, unknown. "I haven't thought beyond today," he admitted. "For so long this mission has been everything." "As it has been for me," Tyen's gaze held his searching. "But missions end. Life continues." A fragile hope stirred within Mason, one he hardly dared acknowledge. "Your people," he began hesitantly, "would they accept a white man among them, one who wished to learn their ways?" The question surprised her, he could tell. Her eyes widened slightly, lips parting before she found words. They might accept a man who had proven himself a friend, who had fought alongside Eagle Clan, who had kept his promise even across 15 years. Even if that man brought nothing but his hands and his heart. Tyen stepped closer, close enough that Mason could see flecks of amber in her dark eyes. "Such gifts are rare," she said softly, "and precious to those who recognize their worth." She reached up, touching his face with gentle fingers. The contact broke something within Mason, a final barrier he had maintained even through their shared dangers and quiet moments. He drew her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that belied the strength in his embrace. "I don't want to lose you again," he whispered against her hair. "Not after finding you." Tyen's arms encircled him, her head resting against his chest, where his heart beat steady and sure. "The eagle always finds its way home," she said simply. "And now, so have you." 3 days later, they rode out from Silver Rock, along the Western Trail. Behind them lay the town, its spires and rooftops diminishing with distance. Before them stretched the open country, rolling hills giving way to mountains, their peaks still capped with snow, despite the advancing spring. They traveled light, carrying only what they needed for the journey to Tyen's people. Mason had sold his cabin furnishings for supplies, and a pack horse keeping only his weapons and the few personal items that held meaning. Among these was his journal, no longer a repository of guilt and regret, but a record of transformation. He had begun a new entry that morning, April 28, 1878. "We leave Silver Rock today, heading west toward the Dragoon Mountains, where Tyen's band has established a winter camp. The agreements we've secured should ensure they can remain there permanently if they choose. Strange to think that after 15 years of looking backward, I now look forward. Not without apprehension, I've no illusion that I'll be immediately welcomed, but with purpose, with hope. They made good progress that first day, pushing the horses at a steady pace until late afternoon. The trail wound through high desert country sagebrush and mesquite, dotted with occasional stands of juniper. As the sun began its descent, they made camp beside a small creek, its banks lush with early spring growth. Mason tended the horses, while Tyen gathered firewood, their movements around the camp harmonized by days of traveling together. When the fire was lit and coffee brewing, they sat side by side watching the flames dance in the gathering dusk. "Will your people truly accept the settlement?" Mason asked, voicing a concern that had nagged at him. "Half justice, as you called it." Tyen considered the question. "They will be wary, suspicious of paper promises from a government that has broken every treaty made with them." She tossed a small branch onto the fire, watching sparks spiral upward. "But they are also pragmatic. Land with guarantees is better than land with none. And me, how will they view me?" Her gaze met his, steady and reassuring. "As I do. A man who has proven himself through actions, not words." She paused. "It will not be easy. Some will remember only that you were once a soldier, but time and truth are powerful allies." Mason nodded, accepting her assessment. He had no right to expect immediate acceptance after what his people had done to hers. Trust would need to be earned day by day, action by action. "Tell me about them," he said. "Your band, your customs, what I should know before we arrive." Tyen smiled, pleased by his interest. As night deepened around them, she spoke of her people, their ceremonies and beliefs, their social structures, their history before white contact. Mason listened intently, asking questions, absorbing everything she offered. Later, as they lay beneath the vast canopy of stars, Tyen pointed out constellations with Apache names telling the stories associated with each. The intimacy of the moment struck Mason not physical, but something deeper. The sharing of knowledge kept alive through generations now entrusted to him. "When we reach your people," he said softly, "what will we be to each other?" Tyen was silent for a long moment. "Among my people," she finally replied, "relationships are not announced, but observed. We will be what our actions show us to be." "And what do you wish those actions to show?" Mason pressed gently. She turned toward him, her face silvered by starlight. "That we are bound by choice, not necessity. That what began in rescue and duty has become something else entirely." Her hand found his. "That an eagle and a wolf can walk the same path." Mason's heart swelled at her words. He raised her hand to his lips, a gesture of reverence more than passion. "I can think of no greater honor than walking that path with you," he said. They continued westward for 3 more days, the terrain growing rougher as they approached the mountains. On the morning of the 4th day, Tyen reined in, suddenly pointing to a distant ridgeline. Mason saw nothing at first, then glimpsed movement, a lone figure on horseback, silhouetted against the sky. "My people," Tyen said. "A scout has seen us." The figure disappeared, but Mason knew their approach had been noted. By midday, they were met by a party of 4 Apache riders who materialized from the landscape so suddenly that Mason, despite his tracking skills, had not seen them approach. The men were armed with rifles and bows, their expressions guarded, but not openly hostile. Tyen spoke to them in Apache, her words flowing too rapidly for Mason to catch any of the few phrases he knew. The leader of the group, an older man with a deeply lined face, responded at length, his gaze repeatedly shifting to Mason with undisguised suspicion. Finally, Tyen turned to Mason. "This is Nahilze, my uncle," He says we may enter their camp. She hesitated. He asks your intentions. Mason straightened in his saddle, meeting the older man's gaze directly. Tell him I come with respect to learn and to serve, that I seek nothing but the chance to prove myself worthy of your people's trust. As Tyen translated, Nahilzai's expression remained impassive, but something shifted in his eyes, not acceptance, but perhaps a willingness to withhold judgment. They rode into the Apache camp as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Unlike the chaotic frontier towns Mason was accustomed to, the settlement had a harmony to its arrangement dwellings positioned to catch morning sun, communal areas centrally located, everything in relationship to the surrounding land. People emerged from lodges as they passed, drawn by the unusual sight of a white man entering their midst without soldiers or government agents accompanying him. Children stared openly, while adults maintained a careful reserve that Mason recognized as neither welcome nor rejection, but watchful waiting. They stopped before the largest dwelling, where an elderly woman stood surrounded by what appeared to be the band's leaders. Tyen dismounted quickly, approaching the woman with obvious reverence. They spoke briefly, then Tyen gestured for Mason to join them. "This is Nita," Tyen said quietly as he approached. "She leads our band, my grandmother's sister." Mason bowed his head respectfully. "I am honored to meet you," he said, keeping his voice gentle but clear. Nita studied him with eyes so dark and penetrating that Mason felt she could see every deed of his life, good and ill. She was tiny in stature, but possessed a presence that commanded attention. When she finally spoke, her voice was surprisingly strong. "Tyen says you helped her bring justice to our people," she said in accented but clear English, "that you fought your own kind to protect our rights." "I fought those who abused their power," Mason corrected carefully. "Not all my kind are enemies to yours." A flicker of something approval perhaps crossed Nita's weathered face. "Come," she said, gesturing toward the lodge. "Tell us what has happened in Silver Rock." The next hours passed in council, with Tyen relating the events of their journey from Redwood's assistance to Blackwood's defeat to the negotiated settlement. Mason spoke when asked, answering questions about territorial politics, military movements, and the legal implications of the agreements. Throughout, he was struck by the elders' pragmatism. There was no jubilation at the partial victory, no bitter denunciation of its limitations, just a careful weighing of what had been gained against what remained to be fought for. When the council ended, Nita spoke directly to Mason. "You have helped our people when others of your race would not. For this, you may stay among us." She paused, her gaze still evaluating. "Whether you become one of us depends on what you do with that opportunity." "I ask for nothing more," Mason replied sincerely. The days that followed were a time of adjustment for Mason, learning the rhythms and customs of the camp, finding his place in a community that viewed him with emotions ranging from curiosity to suspicion to cautious acceptance. He worked hard, taking on whatever tasks needed doing, speaking little but observing much. Tyen moved between worlds with practiced ease. With the elders, she was a respected voice in council, her experiences in the white world giving her insights others lacked. With the children, she was a storyteller, keeping alive the band's traditions. With Mason, she was both guide and companion, helping him navigate the complexities of Apache life. Their relationship developed in the public eye, subject to the community's evaluation. There were no private declarations, no moments of intimate confession as they had shared on the trail. Instead, their growing bond was expressed through shared work, mutual support, the gradual alignment of their daily patterns. A month after their arrival, Mason was invited to join a hunting party, a significant mark of acceptance. The men still watched him carefully, but no longer with open distrust. That evening, as the hunters returned with deer for the communal meal, Nita approached Mason. "Walk with me," she commanded. They moved away from the central fires toward the edge of the camp where the mountain slope began its upward climb. When they were out of earshot of others, Nita stopped. "You wish to marry my grandniece," she said without preamble. Mason's surprise must have shown on his face, because Nita's eyes crinkled with amusement. "I may be old, but I am not blind. I see how you look at her, how she looks at you when she thinks others do not see." "I have not spoken of this with Tyan," Mason said carefully. "No, you have shown respect for our ways." Nita nodded approval. "But I am telling you that such a union would be permitted if she wishes it." Mason felt a surge of gratitude mixed with humility. "Thank you. I would consider it the greatest honor of my life." "It will not be easy," Nita warned. "You will always be between worlds. Your children will carry that burden too." "I know," Mason acknowledged, "but some burdens are worth carrying if they bring truth and understanding with them." Nita studied him a moment longer, then smiled a rare, transformative expression that made her seem decades younger. "You have learned something of our wisdom already, Mason Reed." She touched his arm briefly. "Speak to Tyan when the moon is full. Our traditions say such times are good for new beginnings." The full moon came 3 nights later, rising huge and golden over the eastern mountains. Mason found Tyan at her favorite spot, a flat rock overlooking the valley where she often went to think and observe the changing light. "Nita said I would find you here," he said, settling beside her. "My grandmother used to bring me to this place," Tyan replied. "She said it was good for seeing clearly, not just with the eyes, but with the heart." They sat in companionable silence as the moon climbed higher, its light transforming the landscape into a silver dreamscape. Finally, Mason spoke. "15 years ago, I made a promise to keep safe a child I barely knew. I failed in that moment, but life gave me a second chance." He turned to Tyan, taking her hands in his. "Now I want to make another promise, not from duty or guilt, but from love. To walk beside you for all the days I have left, to build something that honors both our people's ways." Tyan's eyes shimmered in the moonlight. "The eagle flies alone," she said softly, "except when it finds its true match." Her fingers tightened around his. "I would have you as my match, Mason Reed, now and for all seasons to come." Their marriage ceremony took place at summer solstice, a blending of Apache traditions with elements from Mason's heritage. The entire band participated, accepting the union as a symbol of what might be possible between peoples who chose understanding over hatred. As autumn painted the mountains with gold and crimson, word came from Silver Rock. Governor Wallace had kept his word. The Territorial Assembly had ratified the agreements, officially recognizing the band's right to their land. Blackwood had been convicted, sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, and Judge Hamilton had resigned his position, choosing to dedicate his remaining years to reforming territorial law regarding indigenous rights. "It is not complete justice," Tyan observed as they stood together on their rock, watching evening shadows claim the valley. "But it is a beginning. And beginnings are powerful things," Mason replied, his arm around her shoulders. They had built a small cabin at the edge of the camp, a structure that reflected both their backgrounds, with a traditional Apache summer dwelling alongside it. Mason had taken on the role of liaison between the band and territorial authorities, using his knowledge of white ways to protect Apache interests. Tyan continued as keeper of records and traditions, teaching the children to navigate both worlds while maintaining their cultural identity. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of misunderstanding, conflicts between differing perspectives, the inevitable tensions of cultures in contact. But there was also growth, mutual respect, and a slowly spreading recognition that coexistence was possible without domination. As twilight deepened into night, an eagle called from the heights above, a wild, piercing cry that seemed to embody both freedom and connection. Tyen smiled, leaning into Mason's embrace. "The eagle remembers," she said softly, "but it also looks forward to new horizons." Mason tightened his arm around her heart, full with the journey that had brought them here and the path that stretched before them. "Then we'll fly together," he said, "wherever that horizon leads." The eagle called once more before soaring into the darkening sky, wings spread wide against the first emerging stars, not cursed, but blessed, carrying truth across time and distance, soaring above darkness, heart leading the way home.